She had 45 seconds to clear the building before security would physically remove her. Madison Reed knew this because Director Harlan Briggs had said it loud enough for the entire ER waiting room to hear. The rain outside was coming down sideways, and the red emergency lights above the ambulance bay strobed across the wet asphalt in long, bleeding pulses. She picked up her bag. She didn't run. She didn't cry. She walked out through those sliding glass doors with her badge still warm in her palm, and she pressed it into the security guard's hand like she was returning a library book. Behind her, 30-odd people watched. Nurses, orderlies, 2 attending physicians who didn't say a word. And then, before the doors had even finished closing, 3 black SUVs turned off Route 9 and rolled through the front gate of Rivergate Medical Center, military plates catching the light, and every single one of them was moving fast. If this story reaches you, wherever you are watching from, drop your city in the comments below. I want to see how far Madison's story has traveled. And if you haven't subscribed yet, do it now. You're going to want to be here for what happens next. The morning had started the way most of Madison Reed's mornings started at Rivergate, both badly, and before 6 a.m. she had been on since 11 the previous night, which meant she had already triaged a man with a fishing hook through his thumb, talked a teenage girl through her first panic attack, and held a compress against a laceration on an elderly man's scalp for 12 minutes because the on-call resident couldn't find gloves in the right size. By the time the day shift began filing in, Madison had charted 4 patients, flagged 2 for follow-up, and reordered the trauma cart that someone on the previous rotation had left in genuine chaos. Gauze stuffed in the wrong drawers, the defibrillator pads sitting loose on top of the unit instead of sealed in their packaging. She had not eaten. She was 31 years old and she looked it. Not in a soft way, but in the way that people who have seen too much too young sometimes look. Sharp around the eyes, economical in her movements. She kept her blonde hair pulled back tight enough that a few people on staff had commented it looked severe, which she had filed away under things people say when they can't find anything real to criticize. She wore the same navy scrubs as everyone else. She did not wear jewelry on shift. Her sneakers were the brand that nurses who stand for 12 hours buy because they have given up caring about aesthetics and started caring about their knees. She was good at her job. She knew she was good at her job. The patients knew it too, usually, in that particular way patients know. They stopped tensing when she walked into the room. The charge nurse that morning was Donna Pratt, who had been at Rivergate for 19 years and wore this fact like a badge of immunity. Donna had a favorite phrase, "That's not how we do it here," which she deployed at Madison approximately twice per shift, regardless of whether Madison was doing anything wrong. This morning it came when Madison suggested repositioning an elderly man with suspected cardiac involvement away from the drafty curtain near the ambulance bay entrance. "That's not how we do it here, Madison. We keep cardiac obs in Bay 3. Bay 3 is right next to where the door opens every time an ambulance arrives. His core temp is already Bay 3. That's procedure." Madison had moved him to Bay 3. She had also found a spare heated blanket from the supply closet on the second floor and put it over him without telling anyone, because the man's lips had a faint blue tinge she didn't like, and nobody else had noticed or chose to notice. This was the thing about Rivergate Medical Center in Ashcroft, Ohio. It was not a bad hospital in the catastrophic sense. It had functioning equipment. It had staff who technically knew what they were doing. But there was a particular institutional gravity to the place, a slow pull toward mediocrity that Madison had been fighting against for 14 months, and she was tired in a way that had nothing to do with the overnight shift. She had come to Rivergate after leaving military service, which was a sentence she never elaborated on if she could avoid it. When people asked, she said she'd been a medic. When they pressed, she said she'd been deployed. When they pressed further, she usually found somewhere else to be. The details of what she had done and where she had done it were not something she spread around, partly because she had been explicitly asked not to, and partly because she had learned that the civilian medical world had a complicated relationship with military credentials. Half the time, people were impressed in a useless, performative way, and the other half they treated it like a different species of qualification that didn't quite translate. At Rivergate, it hadn't translated. Director Harlan Briggs had made this clear in her first week. Briggs was 54, sandy-haired, going gray, with the build of a man who had played football in college and was still emotionally living there. He ran the administrative side of Rivergate with an emphasis on budget optics and what he called institutional cohesion, which in practice meant that people who caused friction, who asked too many questions, who pushed back on procedure, who had the nerve to be right when he was wrong, tended to find their schedules quietly adjusted, their shift requests denied, their complaints returned with a form letter. He had called Madison into his office 3 times in 14 months. The first was to tell her that her performance review had noted she was resistant to collaborative input. The second was to warn her that 2 attending physicians had complained she was making independent clinical judgments outside her scope. The third, 2 weeks ago, was to place her on what he called a corrective monitoring period, which was a thing he appeared to have invented specifically for this occasion because Madison had looked it up in the HR policy manual and found no reference to it. She had not hired a lawyer yet. She had not filed a complaint with the state board yet. She had been, in retrospect, operating under the assumption that if she kept doing her job well enough, eventually the facts would protect her. This was the assumption that failed her on a Tuesday morning in November, with rain coming down sideways on Route 9. The event that precipitated what happened had begun the previous afternoon, though Madison didn't know this yet. Senator Carver Webb of Ohio, 62, third term, the kind of politician whose face appeared on billboards near highway exits with the word results in block letters, had arrived at Rivergate the previous evening for what Briggs had organized as a private fundraising reception in the hospital's new wing. The new wing was Briggs's project, his signature accomplishment, and he had been courting Webb's support for the state appropriations package that would fund its expansion. This was not unusual. Hospitals and politicians ate off each other's plates regularly in ways that nobody examined too closely. What was unusual was that Senator Webb had not looked well when he arrived. Madison had seen him in the corridor near the administrative suites around 8:30 p.m. when she was coming back from the supply run upstairs. She hadn't known who he was immediately. She recognized the type before she recognized the face, the particular wattage of a man accustomed to having people arrange themselves around him. He was with 2 aides and a woman who appeared to be his personal physician, and he was walking with the careful gait of someone managing something. Not obviously sick, but managing. Madison had noticed his color. She noticed coloring the way most people notice weather, automatically, without deciding to. His face was slightly gray around the mouth. He was sweating lightly, despite the fact that the corridor was cool. He was favoring his left side in a way that could mean nothing or could mean something, and when he passed her, he pressed his hand flat against his sternum for just a second before dropping it. She had considered saying something. She had been calculating how to say something without it being taken as overreach, because everything she did at Rivergate was evaluated for overreach. When his physician had glanced at her with the particular dismissal that some physicians deploy toward nurses in hallways, the look that says, "I see you and I am choosing not to," and Madison had kept walking. She had logged it mentally, the gait, the color, the hand on the sternum, filed it away. She had not forgotten it. By 7:15 a.m., the ER was moving at a pace that Madison recognized as the low hum before something loud. 2 patients waiting on imaging results, one in Bay 3 with the cardiac obs she'd flagged, and a new arrival, a construction worker with a possible radius fracture, who was going to need an orthopedic consult that nobody had ordered yet, because the attending on duty, Dr. Philip Greer, was in with another patient and running behind. Madison had pulled the consult form herself and was filling it in when Donna Pratt appeared at her elbow. "Briggs wants you." "I'm in the middle of war. Now." His words. She handed the consult form to a colleague with a look that she hoped communicated, "Please actually submit this," and followed Donna down the corridor toward administration. Briggs's office was large for a hospital administrator's office, which was itself a data point. He had a view of the parking lot, which had a flagpole which flew both the American flag and a Rivergate Medical Center flag at equal height, which Madison had always found telling in a way she couldn't quite articulate. He was behind his desk when she came in. He did not ask her to sit. There was a man she didn't recognize standing near the window, 50s suit, the quiet posture of someone in HR or legal or both. He had a folder. "Madison," Briggs said. He said her name the way people say it when they've rehearsed the sentence that comes after it. "I'm going to make this simple, okay? Effective immediately, your employment with Rivergate Medical Center is terminated. HR has your paperwork." She had known something was coming. She had not known it would be this direct or this fast. The knowledge sat in her chest like a stone dropping into water. Not surprising, but heavy on impact. On what grounds? She asked. Patient safety concerns. Insubordination. Repeated deviation from standard care protocols. Those are vague. They're documented. Then I'd like to see the documentation. You'll receive it as part of your exit process. He nodded at the man with the folder, who stepped forward and held it out. Turn in your badge to security on your way out. You have 45 seconds to clear the building, and then security will assist you. She looked at him for a moment. There was a specific kind of look that Briggs had. The look of a man who has decided something privately and is now performing the public version of it. She had seen this look on him before, but not like this. Something behind his eyes was tighter than usual. Not just bureaucratic cruelty. Something that looked closer to fear. You have 45 seconds, he repeated. She took the folder. The security guard at the front desk was a young man named Terrence, who had always been decent to her. He looked at the floor when she handed him her badge, which told her the word had already spread. Someone had made sure of it. The waiting room was about a third full. Nurses from the morning shift were visible through the glass partition. Two attendings she recognized. An orderly named Marcus, who she'd worked with on multiple nights and who met her eyes and then looked away. She pushed through the sliding doors and into the rain. The asphalt in the ambulance bay was dark and wet, and the emergency lights above the bay strobed red across it in long, slow pulses, the kind of lighting that exists to signal urgency but becomes background noise inside a hospital. Out here it felt different. Out here it looked like exactly what it was. She stood for a moment in the rain because she had not brought a jacket. She'd arrived for her shift in scrubs and sneakers and her bag, the way she always arrived, because Rivergate was the kind of place she'd never quite thought of as permanent. And she was calculating her next move when she heard tires on wet asphalt. 3 black SUVs, military plates, moving at a pace that was not casual. They came off Route 9 through the front gate of Rivergate in a single file. No lights, no sirens, just the low authority of vehicles that didn't need either. They pulled into the main lot and stopped in a loose formation that blocked the visitor entrance. Doors opened. The men who got out were in uniform. Army, she registered immediately, the branch insignia visible from where she stood, and they moved with the particular economy of people who have been operating in high-stress environments long enough that it had become their resting state. Not aggressive, not theatrical, just efficient and purposeful in a way that civilian security never quite managed. One of them, the senior officer, she could read rank instinctively, lieutenant colonel based on the insignia, stood for a moment outside his vehicle and scanned the front of the hospital. Then he looked toward the ambulance bay. He was looking at the people standing there. Then his eyes stopped. He was looking at her. He said something to the man beside him. That man moved toward the hospital entrance at a trot. The lieutenant colonel walked directly toward Madison across the wet parking lot, unhurried, with the kind of certainty that didn't require speed. She stood there with rain in her hair and a termination folder in her hand and watched him come. "Read," he said when he was close enough. Not a question. "Yes," she said. "I'm Lieutenant Colonel James Varro, Medical Operations Command." He looked at the folder. He looked at her face. His expression didn't change, but something behind it did. "You want to tell me what's happening here?" "I was just terminated." "By whom?" "Director Briggs." Varro looked at the hospital entrance for 3 seconds. Then he looked back at her. "When did you last see Senator Webb?" The name landed in her chest like a trigger being pulled. Her mind went immediately to the corridor the previous night. The color of Webb's face, the hand on the sternum, the gait. "Last night," she said, "around 8:30, he was in the corridor near administration. I had concerns about his presentation that I did not—" She stopped. "What happened?" "He collapsed approximately 40 minutes ago during a meeting with hospital staff. He is currently unresponsive." Varro paused. "The team in there is not getting ahead of it." Madison looked at the hospital doors. The rain was cold. Her scrub top was soaked through. "What do you need from me?" she said. "I need you inside," he said simply. "I was just physically escorted out of that building." "I'm aware." He turned slightly and looked at the two soldiers who had flanked him at a respectful distance. They straightened almost imperceptibly. "That's going to be addressed. But right now, Reed, I need your eyes and your hands in that room." She looked at the folder in her hand. She had spent 14 months being systematically told she was wrong, overreaching, out of scope, not collaborative enough, not compatible enough with Rivergate's institutional culture, by a man who had spent those same 14 months doing something she didn't yet fully understand but was beginning to sense the shape of. She had walked out of those doors 11 minutes ago with her career in a folder and rain coming down on her. "Tell me his current presentation," she said. Vero didn't hesitate. Intermittent loss of consciousness, irregular rhythm per the on-site monitor, reported chest pressure onset yesterday evening per his aide, diaphoresis, peripheral cyanosis developing in the last 20 minutes. Everything she had seen in that corridor the night before arranged itself into a pattern so clear and specific that it felt like a physical thing, like something with weight and edges. Was anyone treating him last night? His personal physician cleared him to continue with the evening's schedule. What medications is he on? We're pulling that now. Madison Reed stood in the parking lot of the hospital that had just fired her, in the rain, with a lieutenant colonel and military personnel at her back, and she thought about the elderly man in Bay 3 with the cardiac blanket. She thought about the construction worker who needed an orthopedic consult that maybe nobody had submitted. She thought about 11 minutes ago and the look on Terrence's face when she'd handed him her badge. "Okay," she said. She dropped the folder. It landed on the wet asphalt, and the rain started to pull the ink immediately. "Let's go." Vero gave the single nod of a man who had expected this answer and led the way back across the parking lot. The sliding doors opened. The ER waiting room was exactly as she'd left it, except everyone in it, the nurses, the orderlies, the two attendings, Marcus, turned to look at the door when she walked back in, flanked by uniformed military personnel, soaking wet, with no badge and no folder and nothing on her face that could be read as anything except forward. Donna Pratt was standing near the charge desk. Her mouth opened. Madison didn't look at her. She looked at Vero. "Which room?" "Conference suite, second floor. They moved him when he collapsed." She was already moving toward the elevator. "What?" Harlan Briggs heard the commotion from his office before he saw it. He heard the specific quality of noise that moves through a hospital when something shifts, not the ordinary urgency of a code, which everyone at Rivergate knew how to manage, but a different register, the kind that happens when an external authority walks into an institution and the institution feels it. He came out of his office to the second-floor corridor and saw the soldiers first, 3 of them, positioned outside the conference suite that he had converted for the senator's use when Webb collapsed. He saw the lieutenant colonel speaking to one of his own on-staff physicians, who was visibly deferring. And then he saw Madison Reed walking down his corridor, wet, badgeless, with the purposeful forward motion of someone who was not asking permission. "What?" He stepped into the corridor. "What is she doing here? She's been terminated. She doesn't have authorization to—" Lieutenant Colonel Vero turned. He looked at Briggs for a moment with an expression that was not hostile exactly, but had the particular flatness of a man who has assessed a situation and rendered a verdict that he is not yet required to announce. "Director Briggs," he said, "she has been terminated. She cannot be on these premises." "Director." The single word stopped him. Vero's voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. "Senator Webb is in critical condition inside that room. I would strongly suggest that you do not make this a conversation about badges." Briggs looked from Vero to Madison, to the soldiers, to Vero again. Something in his face changed. The quality of fear she had seen behind his eyes in his office before was fully visible now. Not the fear of a man who cared about a patient's life. A different kind of fear, the kind that looked backward. Madison didn't wait for whatever came next. She pushed through the door to the conference suite. The senator was on the floor on a traction mat that someone had pulled from the emergency kit, which meant somebody had had the good sense to start there. His personal physician was kneeling beside him, handbagging, expression focused but tight in the way that meant the physician knew something wasn't working and wasn't sure why. A Rivergate cardiologist Madison recognized as Dr. Hessa Noor was at the monitor, reading a rhythm strip, talking quietly to a resident. "Symptomatic bradycardia with intermittent block," Noor said. "We've got—" Madison moved into the room and knelt opposite the personal physician. She put 2 fingers on Webb's wrist. His color was bad. Worse than last night. The grayish cast fully developed now, lips dry, and she could see the slight paradox in his breathing without needing a machine to tell her. "Has he been on any antiarrhythmics?" she asked. Noor looked up. "Who are—" "His medications," Madison said. "Has anyone pulled his full list? His physician has beta blockers?" she asked, looking at Webb's personal physician directly. "What's he on?" The physician hesitated. "Metoprolol, extended release, 200 milligrams." "Since when?" "He started a new prescription 3 weeks ago. Dosage was adjusted." Madison looked at the monitor. She looked at the rhythm strip. She looked at the color of Webb's nail beds and the rate of his breathing and the position he had unconsciously adopted when he collapsed, and she assembled all of this with the fast, unglamorous efficiency of someone who had done clinical assessment in conditions where there was no monitor, no strip, no room, and the light came from an angle that made shadows do unreliable things. "He's in a rate-dependent block," she said. "The bradycardia is suppressing the output. He's not tolerating the new dose." She looked at Noor. "Do you have atropine drawn?" Noor was already moving. "Resident, draw atropine, 0.6 milligrams." "We should discuss," the personal physician started. "There's time to discuss after," Madison said. She looked at him steadily. "Right now, atropine and transcutaneous pacing ready as backup. His pressure?" 78/50, said a nurse who had been so quiet in the corner that Madison had almost not registered her. "Okay." Madison looked at Webb's face. He was pale and still, and his chest was rising in a way that was technically adequate, but felt, in the specific register that she had learned to trust over years of working in places where the margin for error was narrow enough to see through, like something that could stop without much warning. "Let's get ahead of this." She reached for the kit. Outside in the corridor, through the small window of the conference suite door, Harlan Briggs stood in his own hallway and watched the nurse he had fired 11 minutes ago work on the most important patient in his building. His phone was in his hand. He wasn't calling anyone. He was staring at the door, and the thing behind his eyes, the thing that looked like fear, the thing that looked backward, had started to look like something else. Something that understood what it meant for Madison Reed to be back in this building, with soldiers in the corridor, and whatever they had come here knowing. His phone buzzed. He looked at the screen. It was a number he recognized. Not hospital administration. Not legal. Something else. He didn't answer. The buzz stopped, then started again. In the conference suite, Senator Webb's monitor showed a rhythm change, the first meaningful one in 40 minutes. Madison Reed was still working. The rhythm change wasn't dramatic. That was the thing about real medicine that nobody who learned it from television ever quite understood. The meaningful moments were often quiet. A number on a monitor shifting from 38 to 52. A color in someone's fingertips going from the particular gray-blue of compromised circulation to something closer to pink. The change in Webb's rhythm was exactly that. Not a sudden dramatic recovery, not a flatline followed by a shock and a gasp. Just a slow, reluctant stabilization that Madison watched with the focus of someone who knew better than to trust the first good sign. "Pressure's coming up," the coroner nurse said. "I'm 86/58. "Keep watching it," Madison said. I want a reading every 90 seconds. Dr. Noor was on the other side of the mat, her expression shifting through something complicated. Relief, certainly, but also the particular discomfort of a specialist watching someone outside her seniority take clean, decisive command of a situation that she had been managing for 20 minutes without getting ahead of it. She didn't challenge Madison. She was too good a physician for that. But she also wasn't comfortable, and she didn't hide it. "We should get him on a proper gurney," Noor said. "Move him to a monitored room." "Agreed, but not yet." Madison kept her fingers on Webb's wrist, reading the pulse the old-fashioned way, cross-referencing it against the monitor. The monitor could lag. Her fingers couldn't. "Give me 2 minutes. I want his pressure above 90 before we move him." "That's—" the personal physician started. 2 minutes, Madison said again, without heat, without looking up. The personal physician closed his mouth. 90 seconds later, the pressure reading came back at 91, over 63. Madison sat back on her heels. Her knees ached from the hard floor. She hadn't noticed until just now. "Okay," she said. "Let's move him." The process of getting Senator Webb from the conference suite floor to a proper monitored bed in the cardiac observation unit took 11 minutes and required 3 nurses, a transport gurney, and a protracted negotiation in the corridor between Lieutenant Colonel Vero and 2 of Rivergate's senior administrators who had materialized from the upper floors like they'd been waiting for a reason to appear. Madison didn't participate in the negotiation. She walked with the gurney and kept her hand near the monitor leads and let Vero handle the politics, which he appeared to do with the same flat economy he applied to everything else. Harlan Briggs was not in the corridor when they moved the gurney through. She noted his absence the way she noted things she didn't yet understand, filed it, didn't reach a conclusion. The cardiac observation unit on the 3rd floor was a newer wing, part of the expansion project that Briggs had spent 18 months using to court exactly the kind of political support that had brought Senator Webb to this building in the first place. It had good equipment, well-maintained monitoring systems, and a nursing staff that was noticeably more competent than the ER rotation, which was either a staffing priority decision or an accident of seniority, and Madison had never figured out which. The charge nurse on the unit was a woman named Gloria Tate, 50s, experienced, the kind of nurse who communicated almost entirely in precise, clipped statements and had long since stopped performing warmth for administrators. She looked at Madison when the gurney came through. She looked at the soldiers in the corridor. She looked at Webb on the gurney. "Room 4, she said. "I've got a 12-lead setup." "Good," Madison said. They had not worked together before. Gloria didn't ask who she was or why she had no badge. She simply fell into step and moved to room 4, and this was, in Madison's experience, what competence actually looked like in practice. It recognized itself across the room without needing an introduction. Within the hour, Webb was stable. Not good. Stable. There was a distinction, and Madison was careful not to obscure it. His rate had normalized to the low 50s, which was still on the slow side but no longer in the territory where she was watching his respiration with active concern. His pressure had climbed to a range she trusted. He had regained intermittent consciousness, which he used to ask for water, and then, somewhat incongruously, whether his 2 o'clock meeting could be rescheduled. "Senator," Madison said, "your 2 o'clock meeting is the least important thing happening right now." He looked at her from the pillow. He had the eyes of a man who had spent 30 years in rooms where he was the most important person, and he was recalibrating slowly to a room where he was not. "Who are you?" he asked. "Madison Reed, I'm a nurse." "You're with the military people." "Not exactly. We're acquainted." He blinked. His color was still pale, but the gray cast was receding. "You're the one who—" He stopped. "Someone told me— One of the soldiers said you were the one who figured it out." Dr. Noor administered the atropine, Madison said. This was true, and she said it without strategic modesty, just factual distribution of credit. "But you told her to." She didn't answer that. She checked his IV line instead. "Thank you," he said. "You're welcome, Senator. Try to rest." Prompt. In the corridor outside room 4, Lieutenant Colonel Vero was on a phone call that he was conducting in the clipped, low-register cadence of someone managing multiple situations simultaneously. He ended the call when Madison came out and looked at her with the expression she was coming to recognize as his standard one. Attentive, not warm, not cold, simply present. "He's stable," she said. "I know. Gloria briefed me." He paused. "How are you doing?" It was a question she wasn't expecting, which meant she didn't have a ready answer. "I'm fine." "You've been on shift since 11 last night." "I've worked longer." He looked at her for a beat. "Yes," he said. "I know you have." There was something underneath that, something referential, like he was citing a record she hadn't shown him, but he didn't expand on it. "I need to brief you on why we're here, not the senator. The broader picture." I assumed there was one. "Walk with me." They went to the end of the corridor, where a narrow window looked out over the Rivergate parking lot. The rain had slowed to a persistent drizzle. The 3 SUVs were still in the main lot. which Madison could see had attracted attention. There were 2 Rivergate security staff standing near the vehicles, looking unsure about whether they should say something, and clearly deciding not to. "We received a communication 3 days ago," Varro said, "from a source I'm not going to name. It concerned Senator Webb's upcoming visit to Rivergate and included information suggesting his health might be at risk during the visit." He paused. "The communication also included your name." Madison looked at him. "My name?" "Your name, your service record summary, and a specific recommendation that you be present during any medical situation involving the senator." The phrasing was specific. Whoever sent it knew your history. "Who sent it?" "We're working on that." He glanced out at the parking lot. "When we arrived and I was told you'd just been terminated, that changed the urgency level." "You think the termination was connected?" "I think the timing is interesting. Someone fires the one person recommended to handle a medical emergency for a sitting senator on the same morning that senator shows up with a cardiac event." "Yes, I think the timing is interesting." Madison looked at the parking lot too. She was trying to think about this cleanly, without the noise of 14 months of Rivergate building up static in her thinking. She had been fired on what Briggs called patient safety concerns. The documentation in that folder, the one she'd dropped on the wet asphalt, the one that was probably a soggy, ink-blurred mess now, had presumably contained whatever version of events Briggs had constructed. She had not read it. She had been too focused on moving forward. "Briggs didn't answer his phone," she said, remembering the image of him in the corridor, the buzzing phone, the look on his face. Varro turned to look at her. "When?" "After I went into Webb's room. He was in the corridor and his phone went off and he didn't answer. He had that—" She stopped. She was trying to describe a look on a man's face, which was not the kind of evidence that held up in any formal context. "He looked like someone whose plan had gone sideways," she said finally. Varro was quiet for a moment. "Where's Briggs now?" "I don't know. He wasn't in the corridor when we moved Webb." Varro reached for his phone. Harlan Briggs was in his office on the 2nd floor, and he was trying to manage 4 things simultaneously, which meant he was managing none of them well. He had the termination paperwork for Madison Reed on his desk, which had seemed straightforward at 7 a.m., and now looked like a document he'd written himself into a problem with. He had 3 unanswered calls from a number he'd been instructed never to ignore. He had his own legal counsel on hold, not Rivergate's institutional attorneys, his personal counsel, which was a distinction his assistant had noticed and which would be the first thing anyone reviewed if they started reviewing things. And he had the knowledge, sitting cold and specific in the center of his chest, that Senator Webb was alive and stabilized on the 3rd floor because of the nurse he had fired at 7:15 this morning. The knock on his door was not the kind of knock that waited for an answer. It opened before he'd said anything. Lieutenant Colonel Varro came in with 1 soldier and closed the door behind him. He did not sit down. "Director Briggs," and Briggs put the phone down. "Lieutenant Colonel, I appreciate you're here, of course, given the senator's. I want to say first that Rivergate's response to Senator Webb's condition has been—" "I'm going to stop you," Varro said, not unkindly, but firmly. "I have some questions and I'd like direct answers. Are you willing to do that?" Briggs arranged his face into the expression he used for regulatory visits. "Of course." "Madison Reed was terminated this morning." "That's correct. After a documented period of performance concerns, and what time was the termination decision made?" Briggs paused. "I'm sorry?" "When did you make the decision to terminate her?" "Not when it was communicated." "When you made it." The pause was too long. Briggs knew it was too long while he was doing it. The documentation process had been ongoing from it. "I'm asking about the decision. Yesterday? The day before?" "These processes take—" "Director," Varro's voice stayed level. "Senator Webb's aide has informed us that you were aware the senator was not feeling well when he arrived yesterday evening. The aide says you spoke with him about it personally. Is that accurate?" The room was quiet. Briggs could hear the HVAC. He could hear his own pulse, which was not doing something calm. "We spoke briefly," he said carefully. "I was assured by the senator's personal physician that—" "His physician had not yet examined him at the point you were notified. That examination happened approximately 2 hours later. Vero took a step closer to the desk, not threatening, just removing the comfortable distance. You knew the senator was unwell before the reception. You chose not to arrange medical monitoring, and the following morning, before 7 a.m., you terminated the nurse who, we now know, had already flagged concerns about his presentation. She was terminated for unrelated performance. The decision timing, Vero said quietly, is going to be a question that other people ask you. People with more formal authority than I have. I'm telling you this because I think you should understand the shape of what's coming. He paused. Is there anything you want to say to me now before those people arrive? Briggs looked at the man across his desk. He was 54 years old. He had built Rivergate's new wing. He had a family photo on his desk that he was, for the first time in a long time, not looking at. I'd like to speak with my attorney, he said. Vero nodded once. He turned and walked to the door. That would be my recommendation as well, he said, and left. The story moved through the hospital the way stories always move through hospitals. Faster than information, slower than rumor, and arriving at each person slightly distorted by whoever had last touched it. By noon, most of the nursing staff knew that Madison Reed had been terminated and then called back in by military personnel. By 12:30, the version circulating included a detail about Vero threatening to lock down the hospital, which had not happened. By 1, someone in the ER had connected the return nurse to the stabilized patient upstairs, and the comment that was making rounds, delivered in the particular tone of hospital workers who know something is wrong but haven't been told exactly what, was that Briggs had fired her because she was right about something he didn't want her to be right about. This was closer to the truth than rumor usually got. Donna Pratt heard the 1 o'clock version in the break room and stood there for a moment with her coffee going cold in her hand. She had been charge nurse for 12 hours. She had told Madison that Bay 3 was the correct placement for the cardiac obs patient that morning, which it was, technically, by protocol. And the fact that Madison had found a heated blanket anyway was something Donna had been carrying with a particular quality of weight since she'd seen it, just a few minutes before everything else started. She had not thought of it as a meaningful moment when it happened. She was thinking of it now. She brought the blanket story to Gloria Tate on the 3rd floor. She didn't know why, entirely, except that it felt like something that should be on record somewhere, even if it was just said out loud to someone who was already paying attention. Gloria listened. Then she said, "That's the 3rd time someone's told me something like that about her this morning. About something she caught that nobody else did." "She's been doing it for a year," Donna said. Not with admiration, exactly. She was too tired and too honest with herself for that. More like, I have been working next to this and not seeing it clearly. People usually do, Gloria said. Madison was in the 3rd floor family consultation room, which was empty, eating half of a granola bar she'd found in her bag, and looking at the wall when her phone buzzed. It was a number she didn't recognize. She answered it anyway, because at this point the day had established that unknown numbers should be taken seriously. "Reed?" The voice on the other end was male, early 60s, the particular register of someone who was used to being listened to but was currently the one doing the listening. "This is Senator Webb." She straightened. "Senator, you should be resting." "I am resting. I'm resting and calling you from a hospital bed, so I'm multitasking." A pause. "I asked Gloria for your number. She was reluctant." "Good." "She gave it to me anyway." "Less good." He almost laughed. She could hear it abbreviated in his exhale. "I wanted to say something to you that I couldn't say in there with the room full of people. I was listening when you were working. Even when I wasn't fully conscious, I could hear the room, the voices. I could tell who was in charge." He paused. "I've been in enough rooms to know the difference between someone performing competence and someone who actually has it. You have it." She looked at the wall. The granola bar wrapper was in her other hand. "Thank you, Senator. I've also been briefed on some of what's happening with the director." Another pause, heavier this time. "I want you to know, as much as I can say informally at this moment, that I intend to make certain this is looked at properly. Whatever was done to get you out of this building this morning, that's not—" He stopped. She could hear him choosing words carefully. "That's not something I'm going to let go unaddressed." She didn't respond immediately. She was tired and she'd eaten half a granola bar, and it was not quite noon and she had been awake for over 13 hours, which was not unusual for her but was landing differently today. In the specific aftermath of being publicly fired and then called back in, and then spending an hour on a conference room floor managing a cardiac event. "I appreciate that," she said finally. "Get some sleep, Senator." "You too, Reed." She ended the call and sat for another 30 seconds with the granola bar wrapper. Then her phone buzzed again. This time it was Vero. "We have a problem," he said. "Different from the existing problems?" "The security camera footage from yesterday evening. The corridor where you saw Webb. I asked the IT team to pull it for the timeline." "Okay." "The footage from 8 p.m. to 9:30 is gone. That entire window has been deleted from the system." Madison stood up. The granola bar wrapper fell to the floor. "Briggs?" she asked. "The deletion was logged from an admin-level access account. We're pulling the specific credentials now." His voice was steady, but she had spent enough time with him today to hear what was underneath it. "Reed, if the footage was deleted to remove evidence of Webb's condition last night, and to remove the record of you being there and seeing it, then it's not just misconduct," she said. "No," Vero said. "It isn't." She was already walking toward the door. "There's one more thing," Vero said. She stopped. "Your termination paperwork. I had my JAG officer review the file." A pause. "Madison, the performance documentation, some of it is dated incorrectly. The timestamps don't match the HR system's own internal logs. Someone generated documents and backdated them." She put her hand on the doorframe. The hallway outside was the normal mid-morning noise of a hospital floor. Monitors, footsteps, a call button going unanswered for 3 seconds before being picked up. All of it exactly as it always was. "How long?" she asked. "We're still looking. But at least 6 months of documentation appears to have been fabricated after the fact." 6 months. She had arrived at Rivergate 14 months ago, which meant someone had started building a case against her somewhere around month 8, approximately 2 months after she had flagged a procurement irregularity in the ER supply chain to the department head and been told it was a clerical pattern and not her concern. She had noted it and moved on. She had not moved on enough, apparently. "Vero," she said, "what exactly is in my service record that you had access to, that whoever sent you that communication had access to?" He was quiet for a moment. This, she realized, was the first time in the whole day that she'd asked him something. He hesitated over. "Your full Medcom file," he said, "including the classified operations summary." "Which you're not supposed to have." "I have appropriate clearance. But whoever sent you the communication also had access to it, yes." He let that sit, which is part of what we're looking into. Someone had known who she was, not just that she was a nurse at Rivergate. They had known what she'd done before Rivergate, the places she'd been, the people she'd helped keep alive, the commendations that existed in files she hadn't opened since the day she'd left the service. Someone had access to those files and had used them to put Vero in an SUV and drive him to Ashcroft, Ohio, on the same morning Briggs fired her. She didn't know if that was protection or something more complicated than protection. "I'm coming down to the second floor," she said. "I want to see the deletion logs." "Reed, I have 14 months of being told I was wrong about things I wasn't wrong about," she said. "I'd like to start seeing the documentation." She pushed out into the hallway. At the far end of the corridor, near the elevator bank, she saw 2 people she didn't recognize. Not hospital staff, not military. They were in plain clothes, and one of them was holding a document case, and they were speaking to Gloria Tate, who was pointing toward room 4. Federal credentials, Madison thought, reading the posture and the case before she could see any badge. She watched one of them nod at Gloria, and then both of them looked down the corridor. They looked at her. She looked at them. And in the 2 seconds before anyone moved, something occurred to Madison Reed that she had been too busy to consider until this exact moment. Whoever had deleted that security footage, and whoever had fabricated 6 months of performance documentation, had done it carefully, over time, with specific intent, not the behavior of someone reacting. The behavior of someone who had been managing something for a long time and had decided, 3 days ago, or 6 months ago or longer, that the safest way to manage it was to make sure Madison Reed was not in the building. The question that followed was the one she should have asked earlier, the one she had been too tired and too operational to form clearly. What exactly were they managing? The answer was somewhere in this building. She could feel the shape of it. Not the details, not yet, but the mass of it, the thing that was large enough to require this much work to conceal. The two federal agents started walking toward her. Her phone buzzed in her hand. A text from a number she didn't know. 3 words. Check the contracts. She looked at the text for 3 seconds. Then she put the phone in her scrub pocket and walked toward the federal agents instead of waiting for them to reach her. The closer one was a woman, early 40s, dark coat, the kind of flat-soled shoes that said she spent most of her time moving between buildings rather than sitting in them. She had her credentials out before Madison reached her. Department of Health and Human Services, Office of Inspector General. Special Agent Renata Osei. Madison Reed? Yes. We need about 20 minutes of your time. I need something from you first, Madison said. Someone just texted me to check the contracts. From a number I don't have. I'm assuming that's either you or someone you brought with you. Osei looked at her without expression for a beat. Then she glanced at the second agent, male, younger, already pulling out a tablet. That wasn't us, she said. The 3 of them stood in the corridor and processed that for a moment. Then we have a shared problem, Madison said. Where do you want to talk? The family consultation room she'd just left was still empty. They took it. The younger agent, Osei introduced him as Torres, no first name offered, set his tablet on the table and pulled up a file that was thick enough to suggest this investigation had not started this morning. Rivergate Medical Center has been under OIG review for 8 months, Osei said, sitting across from Madison with the posture of someone who was not going to perform preamble. Procurement irregularities flagged by an automated audit system. Supply contracts for the new wing expansion showing consistent pattern deviation. Vendors billing for equipment categories that don't match what was actually received, invoiced quantities that don't reconcile with inventory logs. Madison thought about the supply chain flag she'd raised 14 months ago, the clerical pattern she'd been told not to concern herself with. How large? She said. Current estimate, north of 2.3 million over 30 months, but we're still pulling records. Osei paused. The contracts all route through administrative approval. Briggs's signature is on most of them directly. The ones that aren't directly signed by him route through an office manager named Dale Fitch, who resigned 11 months ago. I don't know Fitch. You wouldn't. He left before anything was visible from the outside. Torres turned the tablet so Madison could see a document. A procurement order, standard hospital formatting, with Briggs's signature block at the bottom. What we couldn't establish until recently was whether the financial irregularities were connected to anything personnel-related, whether people inside the hospital were being managed to protect the procurement system. Madison looked at the document. Then she looked at Osei. You think he fired me because I flagged the supply chain? I think the timing of your termination, combined with the timing of Senator Webb's visit and the deletion of the security footage from last night, suggests that someone made a decision that things were getting too close and moved to consolidate. Osei's voice was even. Not sympathetic, not cold, just accurate. The footage deletion was flagged to us by the same military channel that brought Lieutenant Colonel Varro here. We were already in Ashcroft when it happened. Who sent Varro that communication? 3 days ago. Osei glanced at Torres. Some exchange passed between them that Madison couldn't read. We're working on that, Osei said. It was the same answer Varro had given, which meant either they genuinely didn't know or they knew and weren't saying, and Madison didn't have enough information yet to determine which, so she filed it. The contracts, she said. The text. Someone inside this building knows something specific. Check the contracts. Not look at the finances. Not there's fraud. Contracts. Specific. Agreed, Osei said, which is why I want to ask you something directly. In your 14 months here, did you ever observe anything specific to contract documentation? Not billing patterns, not inventory, actual contract documents. Who had access? Whether anything seemed restricted that shouldn't have been. Madison thought. She was tired and she was trying to think cleanly through the fatigue, which was like trying to see clearly through smudged glass. The supply closet on the second floor, she said. The one I went to for the heated blanket this morning. It's technically labeled a general supply storage, but for about 6 months in the middle of my time here, it had a keycard lock added to it. I noticed because I'd been going there regularly, and one day it required a card I didn't have. When was that? Around month 7 or 8. It was removed again maybe 2 months later. Torres was already typing something. Who had access to that room during those months? Osei asked. Administrative staff, senior nursing administration, I don't know who specifically. Madison looked at the document on the tablet again. But the room directly above that closet is where Briggs held the private reception last night. Osei was quiet for a moment. The event where Webb collapsed. Yes. Another look between Osei and Torres. This one Madison could read a little better. It was the look of a thread that had just connected to something they'd been holding the other end of. We're going to need access to the second floor storage inventory records, Osei said, reaching for her phone, going back at least 30 months. Briggs's people control those records. Yes, Osei said. That's why I'm calling the records request in right now, before anyone in administration has the opportunity to be helpful. The next 40 minutes were the kind that didn't feel like 40 minutes. They felt like a sequence of fast, discrete events that later Madison would struggle to put in exact order, not because she was confused, but because a situation moving quickly compresses time in a specific way, where you're never quite in one moment before the next one starts. Vero appeared at the consultation room door with a printed report from his JAG officer. The backdating on Madison's termination documents was now confirmed across 9 separate files, going back to month 8, the same rough window as the storage room lock, the same window as the initial OIG audit trigger. The documents had been generated using Briggs's administrative credentials, but the metadata showed they'd been created from a workstation in the HR suite, not his office, which put a second person in the frame. Osei took the JAG report and added it to the pile on the table. The table was starting to look like an evidence board. Madison stepped out to check on Webb. Gloria Tate met her at the door to room 4 with the specific face of a charge nurse who has been maintaining professional calm for several hours and is running lower on reserves than she's going to admit. He's sleeping, Gloria said. Pressure's been stable, rhythm's consistent. She paused. There are 4 people in suits in the corridor downstairs. I know. How bad is this going to get? Madison looked at her honestly. I don't know yet. But it's not going to get worse for the patients, I can tell you that. Gloria held her gaze for a moment, then nodded once. Okay. She glanced at room 4. He asked about you again before he fell asleep. Asked if you were still here. I'm still here. She went back to the consultation room. On. The text about the contracts was still sitting in her phone when the hospital's head of facilities management knocked on the consultation room door at 12:47 and asked, with the specific anxiety of a man who had been summoned rather than choosing to appear, if this was where he should be. His name was Roland Petit, a thin man with careful posture who had been at Rivergate for 6 years, and who Madison had interacted with exactly twice, both times about ventilation issues in the ER. He looked at Osei's credentials, and then at the table full of documents, and then at Madison, who he seemed to find simultaneously familiar and not familiar enough, the way people look at someone they know from one context suddenly placed in another. I got a call from someone on your team, he said to Osei. Sit down, Mr. Petit. Osei gestured to the chair across from her. We need to talk about storage access logs. What came out over the next 20 minutes was not the dramatic revelation that the text message had implied. It was smaller than that, more granular and more damaging. The second floor storage room had been accessed during the locked period by 4 keycard credentials. 2 were assigned to administrative staff Madison didn't know. One was Briggs's. The 4th was assigned to a vendor representative from a company called Hartwell Medical Solutions, which was one of the primary suppliers named in the OIG procurement review. A vendor had direct keycard access to a locked storage room inside the hospital. Is that normal? Torres asked Petit. Petit looked at his own hands. No, he said quietly. That is not normal. Who approved the vendor access? The access log shows an administrative override, Director Briggs's credential. He looked up. I didn't know the access had been granted until I pulled the logs 20 minutes ago. I was told the room was restricted for inventory reconciliation purposes. And you didn't question it. I was told not to. He stopped. I was told it was a sensitive administrative matter related to the wing expansion and that facilities management didn't need to be involved. Osei wrote something down. Mr. Pettit, I need you to stay available for the next several hours. Don't discuss this conversation with anyone in hospital administration. I understand, he said. He stood to leave. At the door, he stopped. I want to say, I don't know all of what's in those logs, but I know the supply discrepancies have been wrong for a long time. I've seen requisitions that didn't match what showed up. I thought it was clerical. I should have pushed harder. Yes, Osei said without judgment, but without softening it either. You should have. Thank you for coming in. He left. Madison looked at the door after it closed. Pettit wasn't a bad person. He was a person who had been in a building where the gravity pulled toward accepting things, and he had gone along with the pull the way most people did, and he was going to have to live in the particular discomfort of that for a while. She understood the feeling. Varro found her in the corridor at 1:15 with the expression that had replaced his earlier flatness. It was still controlled, but there was something sharper underneath it, the look of a situation that has moved into a phase he'd been anticipating. Briggs tried to leave the building, he said. Madison looked at him. When? 12 minutes ago. His car was in the main lot. Security at the entrance, my people, stopped him. On what authority? Osei's request. She has enough for a material witness hold at this point. He's back in his office. Varro's jaw shifted slightly. He had a box. Looked like he'd cleaned out his desk. She thought about the phone call he hadn't answered, the number that had been trying to reach him. Did he make any calls? His cell shows 2 outgoing calls between 11 and noon, both to the same number. Number is registered to a Shell LLC out of Columbus. We're running it. The vendor, Madison thought, Hartwell Medical Solutions, or whatever was behind Hartwell Medical Solutions. Briggs had been trying to reach his contact who had apparently been texting Madison from an unknown number telling her to check the contracts. Someone is trying to cooperate, she said. Varro looked at her. That's the working theory. The vendor, or someone adjacent to the vendor. They knew what was in those contracts. They knew that if the right person looked at the right documents, Briggs wouldn't be able to manage the narrative. She paused. They sent you the communication 3 days ago too, didn't they? Not a whistleblower inside the hospital, someone on the outside. Varro didn't answer directly, which was the same as answering. We're going to need you in a formal interview with Osei's team later today to put your supply chain observation on record. I know. She was already thinking past the interview into the shape of what came next. The documentation that would need to be assembled, the timeline, the evidence chain that connected Briggs's procurement fraud to her termination to the security footage deletion, all of it running parallel to the fact that Senator Carver Webb was asleep on the 3rd floor with a stabilized cardiac rhythm because she had been in the right corridor at the right time 8:30 last night and noticed the color of his face. One thing, she said, my service record. Varro, whatever's in that classified summary, who else knows? He was quiet for a moment. As of this morning, it's been shared with Osei's team, at my authorization. He met her eyes. I thought it was relevant to establishing who you are, in the context of what Briggs did. I should have asked you first. I didn't. I'm telling you now. She looked at him. She appreciated the directness more than she was going to say. What's the reaction? Osei's words were... He paused, with something that was almost dry. That explains some things. Madison made a sound that was approximately the shape of a laugh, but didn't quite make it all the way. Okay, she said. Let's go put it on record. They turned toward the elevator. Her phone buzzed. The same unknown number. Room 214. Before they get there, she stopped walking. Varro looked at her. Room 214, she said. What's in room 214? He pulled out his phone and checked something. His face changed in a specific way. Not alarmed, but recalibrated. That's listed as administrative storage. 2nd floor. He looked up. It was reclassified from the general supply closet 8 months ago. The locked room. The vendor access. The keycard that had been granted and then quietly removed. Someone still has access, she said, and they want us in there before Briggs's people can reach it. Vero was already moving toward the stairwell. Madison followed 2 steps behind, and somewhere in the back of her mind the thought was assembling itself. Not the contents of the room, not yet, but the fact that whoever was sending these messages had been inside this system long enough to know exactly what was where. Long enough to know what the room contained. Long enough to know that whatever was in it was the piece that would make the rest of it irrefutable. The stairwell door opened onto the second-floor corridor, and they turned toward the administrative wing, and 3 doors down from Briggs's office, where 2 of Vero's soldiers were currently stationed outside, was a door marked 214, no window, standard hospital gray, with a keycard panel that had a small green LED that should not have been active. The LED was green. Vero looked at Madison. She looked at the door. He pushed it open. The room was not empty. It was not a storage room in any meaningful sense, or it had been once, and then it had been used as something else. And the evidence of that use was still here. A folding table against the far wall with a laptop that was open and running, a portable drive attached to its USB port. Cardboard boxes stacked along the right wall, and Madison could see from the doorway that the boxes were labeled with vendor names. Hartwell Medical Solutions, and 2 others she didn't recognize. Beside the laptop, a manila envelope. And sitting in the single chair at the table with his coat still on and his hands flat on the surface in front of him was a man Madison had never seen before. Late 50s, careful eyes. Not scared, exactly. He was past the scared part, she thought, until whatever came after the decision to do something irreversible. He looked at Madison first, then at Vero, then back at Madison. "You're Reed," he said. "Yes. I worked for Hartwell for 9 years. He looked at the envelope. Everything in there. The original contracts, the actual delivery records, the invoices, the sign-off chain. It's all in there. Physical copies. I kept them." He paused. "I kept them because I thought someday I might need them, and I needed them to be somewhere Briggs couldn't reach." Vero stepped into the room. "What's your name?" The man looked at him steadily. "My name is Warren Galt. I was Hartwell's account manager for Rivergate from the beginning of the wing expansion." He looked at his own hands. "I've been trying to figure out how to do this for 4 months. I didn't know how to do it without ending up with nothing to show for it." He glanced at the envelope again. "Then 3 days ago I found out who she was." He nodded at Madison. "What she'd actually done. Before this place." Madison stood in the doorway and looked at this man. This tired, careful, frightened man who had kept a manila envelope in a locked hospital room for 4 months trying to find the right moment. And she felt something settle in her chest. Not relief. It was too complicated for relief. It was the specific weight of a thing that has been in motion for a long time, finally making contact with something solid. "Mr. Galt," she said, "I think you should talk to Agent Osei." He nodded. He looked like a man who had been holding something heavy and had just been told it was okay to put it down. Vero's radio crackled. He looked at it. His expression changed. "What?" Madison said. "3rd floor." His voice was flat in a way she'd learned meant he was managing something. "Webb's monitor is alarming. Gloria's calling for a physician." Madison was already moving back into the corridor. Behind her, she heard Vero tell Torres to secure the room and the man inside it, and then she was at the stairwell door and pushing through it, taking the stairs at a pace that had nothing in it of the controlled, deliberate movement she'd been operating in all morning. Something had changed upstairs. Something had changed in the 30 minutes since she'd checked on him, and his rhythm was stable and his pressure was holding, and Gloria had said he was sleeping. She hit the 3rd floor door and came out into the corridor at a run, and through the window of room 4 she could already see the monitor, and she could already see the rhythm on the screen, and it was not the rhythm she'd left him with. It was not the rhythm of a man who was going to be fine without immediate intervention. She pushed through the door to room 4, and the first thing she registered was the sound. The monitor alarm. A persistent, toneless beeping that cut through the ambient noise of the floor the way those sounds were designed to, without regard for the disruption it caused to everyone within earshot. The second thing she registered was Gloria Tate at the bedside, already on the phone, already talking to someone. And the third was Webb himself, conscious, which was something, but pale again in a way that had moved back toward that gray around the mouth coloring that she'd seen in the corridor the night before. "What happened?" Madison said, moving to the monitor. "He woke up about 4 minutes ago, said he felt pressure in his chest again, then the rhythm shifted." Gloria had the phone away from her ear now. "I've got cardiology on call coming up." Madison looked at the strip. Not the rate-dependent block from this morning. This was different. The pattern was irregular in a way that registered in her chest before her mind had fully articulated what she was seeing. Paroxysmal atrial fibrillation. Not uncommon in a man Webb's age with his presentation, but not something to let ride without an immediate decision about management, because AFib in the context of a recent cardiac event and an already complicated medication history was the kind of situation that required someone to make a call and make it fast. "Senator," she said, moving to his side, "I need you to focus on me. Where exactly is the pressure?" He had one hand on his sternum, the same place she'd seen him touch it in the corridor last night. "Here. Like, it's not pain exactly, it's a weight. Scale it for me." 4, maybe 5. "Radiating anywhere?" "No, just here." She checked his pulse at the wrist. Irregular, rate in the low 90s. She looked at his face and his color and the way he was breathing. He was anxious, appropriately anxious for someone who had already collapsed once today, but his respiration was even and his eyes were tracking, and when she'd asked him to focus on her, he had. "Okay," she said, "you're in an irregular rhythm. It's manageable. I need you to slow your breathing down. In for 4 counts, out for 6. Can you do that?" "I was a senator for 3 terms, he said. "I know how to control my breathing." "Good. Start now." He started. She watched his chest. Then she looked at Gloria. "Has cardiology reviewed his medication reconciliation since this morning?" Dr. Noor ordered a panel, but the results aren't back yet. "I want to know his current potassium and magnesium before anyone talks about pharmacological cardioversion. And I want to know it in the next 10 minutes. Labs are in the system. Then get them out of the system and in front of someone who can act on them." She looked at the monitor again. "Is his physician still in the building?" "He left at 11. She noted that and moved past it. "Get me Noor, Sab." Dr. Hessa Noor arrived 4 minutes later, looked at the strip, looked at Madison, and made the same face she'd made that morning, the complicated one. But shorter this time, like she'd already processed one round of this and had come out the other side with a different setting. "Rate-controlled approach?" Noor asked. "He's hemodynamically stable, pressure's holding. I'd rather rate control and wait for the labs before we go further." Madison stepped back slightly. It was Noor's patient, Noor's call, and she'd learned today that this particular cardiologist was competent enough to deserve the appropriate deference. "But I want the potassium before anything." Noor was already at the computer in the corner. "It's back, 3.1. Low. Not critically low, but low enough to matter in the context of managing an arrhythmia in a man who had already had one cardiac event today. Madison had suspected it. The new metoprolol dose, the stress, the fact that Webb had almost certainly not eaten or drunk adequately in the past 24 hours, given the evening reception and then the collapse. "Magnesium?" she asked. 1.7. "Okay." She looked at Noor. "Supplementation before we touch anything else. Potassium and magnesium both." "IV." Noor nodded. She was already writing the order. "Agreed." Webb was watching them from the pillow with the eyes of a man who understood enough of what was being said to be scared but had made a decision to hold still. "Is this the same problem as this morning?" he asked. "Related," Madison said. "Different presentation. We're managing it." "Am I going to be okay?" She looked at him for a moment. She didn't do the thing some people did in these situations, the reflexive, automatic reassurance that was really just a way of not answering. "You're stable. Your pressure is acceptable. We're addressing the rhythm with the right approach. Those are the facts." She paused. "The answer to your question depends on the next 30 minutes, so let me focus on those." He closed his eyes and resumed the breathing pattern she'd given him. The 30 minutes were, in the specific way of medical situations, both very long and very compressed. Madison stayed in or near room 4, while Noor managed the supplementation order and the nursing staff ran the IV. She was aware, in the background of her concentration, that the second floor was generating its own activity. She could hear it in the quality of the sounds coming up the stairwell, voices at a register that meant something was happening that wasn't routine. She didn't go to look. Webb was her immediate obligation, and she was not going to fragment that attention because of something happening one floor below. At the 22-minute mark, the monitor showed the first sign of rhythm conversion. Not complete, not clean, but the beginning of the irregular pattern reorganizing itself. By 31 minutes, Webb was back in sinus rhythm. Still slow, still not where she wanted it, but sinus. Noor looked at the strip and let out a breath. "Okay," she said. Not triumphant, just okay. The word of a physician who has been doing this long enough to know that okay is what you get, and that okay is enough. Webb opened his eyes. "Is that better?" "Yes," Madison said. "That's better." He looked at the ceiling for a moment. Then, "I heard someone say my name downstairs when I was being moved. Someone said, one of the military people said something about why I was here, the visit, the timing." He stopped. "Was this building safe for me to come to?" The question landed in the room, and nobody answered it immediately. Madison and Noor exchanged a look. Not a conspiratorial one, just the look of two people who both understood that the honest answer to that question had implications that neither of them was positioned to navigate right now. "Senator," Madison said, "that's a question the people downstairs are better equipped to answer than I am. What I can tell you is that you're safe right now." He was quiet for a moment. "But something happened here that shouldn't have." "Yes," she said. "Something happened here that shouldn't have." He nodded, once, the nod of a man deciding to accept a partial answer. "All right," he said. The second floor had, in the 31 minutes Madison had been upstairs, become a different kind of place. She came down the stairwell and into the corridor and felt the change before she saw it. The particular tension of a space that has had something happen in it, the way air feels different after pressure has moved through. 2 additional OIG agents had arrived, ones she hadn't seen before, and they were in the hallway outside room 214 with Torres, who was on his phone. Varro was at the far end of the corridor near administration, speaking with a man in a suit that was different from the suits Osei's team wore. Not federal, something adjacent, the kind of suit that came with a briefcase and a primary obligation to someone being held. She found Osei just outside the administrative suite. "Webb?" Osei asked immediately. "Stable. AFib. Converted. He's okay." Osei visibly adjusted something. Not relief exactly, but a recalibration of the afternoon's probability landscape. "Good, because the last 40 minutes have been productive." "Tell me." "Warren Galt." Osei's voice was controlled and fast. "His envelope. The physical contracts confirm what our audit suspected but couldn't fully substantiate. The invoices from Hartwell Medical Solutions were fabricated at the line item level. Not just inflated, fabricated. Equipment that was never ordered, never received, billed, and signed for. Briggs's signature on every approval. The kickback structure is in Galt's notes. He kept records of every payment transfer he was instructed to make to a holding account registered to a numbered company in Delaware. How much total? Once we include what Galt documented from Hartwell's internal records, we're looking at closer to $3.8 million over 31 months. Madison did the math without meaning to. 31 months. She had arrived at Rivergate 14 months ago. She had flagged the supply chain irregularity at month 8. The lock on the storage room had appeared at month 7 or 8. Briggs had put her on a corrective monitoring period 2 weeks ago, which meant the fabricated documentation had likely been initiated around the same time, 6 months ago, give or take, when the OIG audit had already been running for 2 months, and someone in Briggs's network had presumably learned that there was federal attention on Rivergate's procurement records. "He knew about your investigation," she said. "Someone in his network knew. We're working on how." Osei glanced toward administration. "Briggs's attorney arrived 20 minutes ago. They're in his office. He's not talking, but Galt is." "Galt is cooperating." "Fully. He has been for the past 40 minutes. She paused. He says he tried to find a way out of this for 4 months. He says when he learned your service background through Hartwell's internal network, which had apparently accessed the same military communication channel that flagged Vero, he decided you were the right person to send it through. Why me specifically? Osei looked at her for a moment. He said, and this is a direct quote, because she was already in the building and she already wasn't going to let it go, and I needed someone who wasn't afraid of Briggs. She paused. He watched your termination on the parking lot camera footage, the footage from outside which wasn't deleted. He saw you hand in your badge and he saw you come back in with the military, and he decided. Madison stood in the corridor and thought about this. About Warren Galt in a locked storage room with a manila envelope, watching a camera feed of a parking lot, making a calculation about a woman he had never met based on what he knew of her history and what he had just watched her do. He's still in the room? She asked. Torres is with him. His attorney's on the way. Osei's phone buzzed. She looked at it. One more thing. The numbered Delaware company that Briggs's kickback payments went to. We have a name attached to the registration. She looked up. Dale Fitch, the office manager who had resigned 11 months ago. He's still connected, Madison said. He never left. He just moved off the org chart. Osei was already moving. We have a warrant request in. We'll have his location before the end of the day. What? Harlan Briggs sat in his office with his attorney, a man named Lowell Park, whom he had retained 3 years ago for a commercial dispute and had never expected to need in this particular way, and tried to organize the morning into something manageable. This was a skill he had relied on for 20 years of administrative work. The ability to take a complicated situation, identify the components, and find the frame that presented them in the most favorable light. It was not working today. Park was 56 and expensive, and he had said very little since arriving, which Briggs was interpreting as either strategy or concern and couldn't tell which. He had reviewed the 2-page summary Briggs had given him about the termination, the federal agents in the building, the military personnel, and Senator Webb's medical collapse, and he had looked up from it with an expression that was not reassuring. The footage deletion, Park said. Tell me that wasn't you. Briggs was quiet. Harlan. The footage was deleted to remove. There were concerns about what the footage showed that could have been misinterpreted out of context. Stop. Park put his hand flat on the desk. Do not tell me what it was deleted for. Tell me who deleted it. The access was through my credentials, but I wasn't your credentials. Someone used your credentials to delete footage the morning a federal investigation team arrived at this hospital, and you are telling me that person was not you. The sentence sat in the room. Briggs heard it the way you hear something you already knew but hadn't said out loud. It was Fitch, he said finally, quietly. He still has remote access to the system. I didn't know he was going to. He stopped. He called me yesterday evening when Webb arrived. He said there was a problem. He said Reed had seen something and he was going to manage it. Park was very still. Where is Fitch now? I don't know. He called twice this morning. I didn't answer. Park stood up. He straightened his jacket. He looked at Briggs with the specific expression of a man recalculating what the next several hours of his life were going to look like. I need you to sit here, he said, and not talk to anyone, answer any calls, or make any decisions until I come back. Can you do that? What are you? I need to speak with the federal agent in charge of whatever this is. As your counsel, I am going to tell her that you are prepared to make a proffer. He picked up his briefcase. You had a procurement arrangement that has become a legal problem. Fitch escalated it without your knowledge or authorization in ways that have made it significantly worse. If that's the truth, he looked at Briggs hard. Is that the truth? Yes, Briggs said. Mostly. Mostly, Park repeated flatly. He walked to the door. Sit. Don't move. He left. The soldiers outside Briggs's door didn't stop him, which confirmed what Briggs had already understood. They weren't there to keep anyone out. They were there to keep him in. He sat in his chair. Through the window, he could see the parking lot. The military vehicles were still there. A gray sedan had arrived. Federal. He could tell from the plates and the way it was parked, with the casual authority of a car that doesn't worry about tow zones. His phone, face down on the desk, buzzed twice. He didn't touch it. Monk. The proffer conversation happened in the family consultation room on the third floor, which had become, by early afternoon, Osei's informal command post. Park sat across from her for 37 minutes. Madison was not in the room. She had no formal role in the investigation, and Osei was careful about procedural integrity. But Varro briefed her afterward in the corridor outside, in the compressed, accurate shorthand she'd learned was his standard mode. Briggs is giving up Fitch, Varro said. Full description of the arrangement. Fitch managed the actual contract fabrication and the Hartwell relationship on the ground. Briggs approved and signed. The kickback payments went through Fitch's Delaware company, and Briggs received a secondary arrangement, a construction contract for a property he owns in Sandusky, done below market by a Hartwell-connected firm. So Briggs took his money differently, and could claim he didn't know the full extent of the financial fraud. Whether that holds up, he left it there. His proffer includes the footage deletion. He's saying Fitch acted unilaterally. His attorney is arguing Briggs had no knowledge that Fitch still had system access. Does Osei believe that? Osei believes it's partially true and strategically shaped, which is usually how it goes. He paused. Your termination documentation. Briggs is saying Fitch generated the backdated documents without his explicit direction, that he provided Fitch with general authorization to manage the Reed situation, and that Fitch, who had system access and knew Briggs's preferences, went further than instructed. Madison processed this. The specific flavor of it, the way bureaucratic cowardice dressed itself as culpable deniability, was something she had encountered in other forms, in other institutions, and it never stopped being the particular kind of infuriating that made your jaw tight. He told someone to make me go away, she said. He just wants to argue he didn't specify how. Yes, Varro said. That's the argument. Is Osei going to accept it? She's accepting the proffer as information. What she does with Briggs separately is her call. He looked at her steadily. The termination documentation being fabricated is obstruction regardless of who generated it, and the supply fraud carries mandatory minimum sentencing guidelines. Whatever Briggs' attorney negotiates, the outcome for Briggs is not good. It's a question of degree. She looked at the hallway, at the ordinary mid-afternoon activity of a hospital floor, nurses changing shifts, a transport aide moving a wheelchair, the soft ongoing normalcy of a place that continued operating regardless of what was happening in the administrative suite 2 floors below. What about me? She said, not asking for reassurance, asking for information. Your termination is legally invalid. Osei's office will put that in writing before the end of the day. Your HR file, the fabricated documentation, will be flagged as falsified and removed from the official record. He paused. The board will need to be notified. That's a separate process. But Rivergate's legal exposure on the wrongful termination alone is significant enough that the board's response is going to be, he paused, choosing the word, motivated. She looked at him. Is that your way of saying they're going to be scared? Yes, he said, without embellishment. By 3:30, the story had moved past the hospital's internal rumor network and into something more formal. 2 local news vehicles had appeared in the parking lot, not close enough to the entrance to be on hospital property, parked with the careful positioning of crews who knew exactly where the line was. A Rivergate communications staff member had been seen moving quickly between the administrative suite and the front reception area, which was the specific motion of an institution trying to get ahead of something it had already lost control of. Madison was in the break room on the 3rd floor with a cup of coffee she hadn't asked for, but that Gloria Tate had put in front of her with the expression of someone performing a kindness through an action small enough not to require acknowledgement. She drank it. It was slightly burned and not sweet enough, and it was the best thing she had consumed all day. Her phone showed 4 missed calls from a number she recognized as her sister's, Priya, who was in Columbus and who Madison had not spoken to in 3 weeks, and who had clearly seen something on a news feed. She would call Priya back. Not right now. Marcus, the orderly from the ER, appeared in the break room doorway. He was a big man who moved quietly, which was a useful combination in the work he did, and he had the look of someone who had been thinking about whether to come in here for a while and had decided to do it anyway. Hey, he said. Hey, He stood in the doorway for a moment. "I watched you walk out this morning," he said. "I didn't say anything." She looked at him. He was not saying it as an excuse. He was saying it as a fact, with the particular discomfort of a man who had come to deliver it directly rather than carry it around. "I know," she said. "That was wrong," he said. "I should have said something." "What would you have said?" He was quiet for a moment. "I don't know, something." He looked at the floor. "You found that guy's blanket this morning, the one in Bay 3. "Yes." "That's the kind of thing you always did that. And I let Donna make it look like you were doing something wrong when you were just—" He stopped. "Anyway, I wanted to say that." She looked at him for a moment. He was 30, maybe 5, working a job that required him to be invisible most of the time in a building that had spent a year treating competence as a management problem. And he had come in here to say something he didn't have to say, and that was its own kind of thing. "Thank you, Marcus," she said. He nodded and left. She finished the coffee. Varro found her at 4 o'clock with a different quality to his presence. Not the operational urgency of the morning, not the controlled urgency of the afternoon, but something settled, the posture of a situation that has moved into a new phase. "Fitch," he said. They found him. "Where?" "Columbus." He was at a hotel near the airport. He paused. He'd booked a flight to Toronto for 6 p.m. OIG, and Columbus PD had him at 3:47. She thought about the morning's phone calls, the number that had kept calling Briggs, the 2 calls Briggs had made but not been answered. Fitch, understanding that the situation was unraveling, and making the specific calculation that the way out was across a border rather than through a conversation. "What's the charge?" "Wire fraud to start. The OIG warrant covers the financial fraud. Columbus PD is holding him on obstruction pending the federal paperwork." He looked at her steadily. The footage deletion logged from Briggs's credentials. Forensics pulled the access point. It was a remote login from a Columbus IP address. "Hotel Wi-Fi." He paused. "Fitch deleted the footage this morning from a hotel room. The footage from 8 p.m. to 9:30, which would have shown Webb's condition in the corridor, which would have shown Madison noticing it, which would have been the precise visual record of everything Briggs and Fitch had been trying to suppress. "And my service record," she said. "How did their network have access to a classified military file?" Varro's expression shifted. Just slightly, just enough. "Galt is still talking. He says Hartwell had a data broker relationship, an outside firm that specializes in personnel research for defense-adjacent contractors. They run background on hospital administrators, potential partners. The research firm had access to certain semi-public military databases through a federal contractor license." He paused. "Your record is classified, but your service branch, years of service, and unit designation are technically accessible through a specific federal portal that private contractors with certain clearances can query. Someone at Hartwell ran a deep query on Rivergate's nursing staff when they were evaluating their exposure. They were building a file on hospital employees. They were building files on anyone who might be a risk to the arrangement." He let that sit. "When they ran you, the query flagged your unit designation and your service dates. Someone recognized what that meant. That information is what went to me, not through Hartwell, but through a separate channel that we're still pulling apart. Someone at Hartwell decided to use you rather than protect Briggs." "Galt," she said. "That's our current theory. He knew what your service history implied. He decided you were the lever." She stood in the hallway with this. The idea that the path back into this building had been built by someone she'd never met, using a record she'd spent years not talking about because a man in a hotel room in Columbus had looked at a data query and made a calculation. It was not the story she would have told about this day if someone had asked her to tell it. It was messier than that. It had more people in it than that. The line between what she'd done and what had been done around her was harder to draw than it looked from the outside. "Varro," she said, "my classified summary, what specifically is in it?" He looked at her for a moment. He had the careful expression of a man deciding what version of directness to use. "Do you want the short version or the full version?" "Short. 3 deployments, 2 medals. A commendation from a special operations commander that describes, in specific language, A 12-hour field medical situation in which you kept 6 members of a team alive under conditions that the commendation says, quote, exceeded any reasonable expectation of outcome. He paused. And a classified operation summary that describes a situation in which you made a call, alone, without backup or communication, that the debrief describes as the correct call, and that saved 4 lives. She had not read that debrief. She had been present for the events it described, but she had not read the formal document that assembled them into language, because reading it had felt like something she wasn't ready to do, and then time had passed, and it had stopped feeling like something she would ever be ready to do. She looked at the wall. The nurse everyone mocked, Varro said quietly, is in that file. The whole version. She didn't answer that. She turned back toward the corridor and the ordinary noise of the floor and the task that was still in front of her, Webb's next vital check. The cardiology follow-up Noor had scheduled for 5. The formal interview with Osei's team that would need to happen before the evening. I'll go check on the senator, she said. Varro let her go. Webb was awake and had eaten half a bowl of soup that someone had brought up from the cafeteria, which Madison took as a positive indicator beyond the clinical one. His rhythm had held through the afternoon. His color was better, not good, but better. And he had the slightly depleted, clear-eyed quality of a person who has been genuinely frightened and has come out the other side of it into a kind of provisional calm. He looked at her when she came in. Your face is different, he said. I've been awake for about 16 hours. Not tired. Something happened. She sat in the chair beside the bed. She was not going to brief a senator on an active federal investigation from a hospital chair, but she could tell him what was true at the level he was asking about. Some things were resolved today, she said. Others are still moving. Am I in danger? No, you were in a building where something was wrong. The wrong thing is being addressed. He was quiet for a moment. Then, I want you on my care team, for however long I'm in this building, officially. Dr. Noor is your cardiologist. She's good. I know she's good. I want you too. He looked at her directly. You don't have to agree to it right now, but I want it on the record that it's my preference. She looked back at him. She was tired and her knees still ached from the floor this morning, and she had a formal interview to get through in the next 2 hours, and she had not called her sister back yet. But Webb's rhythm was holding, and the color in his face had moved from gray to something closer to human, and this was the specific outcome she had been working toward since she walked back through those doors this morning. I'll think about it, she said. He nodded. Fair. But the interview with Osei's team lasted 90 minutes and covered, in documented detail, everything Madison had observed from her first week at Rivergate through this morning. The supply chain flag at month 8, the storage room lock, the corrective monitoring period, the termination, Webb's presentation in the corridor the night before. Osei and Torres were thorough in the way of people who knew exactly what they needed and were making sure they got it in a form that would hold up in a proceeding. Madison answered everything directly and without editorializing, because editorializing was what people did when they were uncertain about what the facts looked like standing alone, and she was not uncertain. At 6:15, when the interview concluded, Osei put her pen down and looked across the table. I want to tell you something off the record, she said. You don't have to listen to it. Go ahead. We've been building this case for 8 months. Financial fraud cases are slow and granular and they don't move fast. What happened today? Webb's collapse, Varro's arrival, Galt coming forward, compressed the final phase of this investigation by probably 6 months. She paused. The reason any of that happened is because you were still in the building, doing your job, after the man responsible for the fraud fired you. Madison looked at the table. The supply chain flag you raised at month 8, Osei continued. We have that in our audit trail. That flag generated a data point that helped calibrate the procurement review. She folded her hands. You were doing the right thing correctly, the whole time, in a building designed to make you stop. The room was quiet. Madison was aware that she was tired enough that things were landing differently than they might have otherwise, with less filtering, closer to center, and she allowed herself to feel the weight of what Osei had said for exactly the amount of time it took to take a breath and let it out. Thank you, she said. Osei nodded. We'll be in touch. Keat. By 7 p.m., the remaining nursing staff on the day rotation had heard enough of the accurate version of events to understand what the inaccurate versions had been gesturing at all day. Donna Pratt had spent the late afternoon in a state of quiet that was, for Donna, unusual enough to be its own kind of statement. She had not sought Madison out. She had not avoided her either. She had done her work with the particular focus of a person who is thinking about something they cannot currently resolve. Dr. Philip Greer, the attending who had not said anything when Madison was escorted out that morning, had signed the orthopedic consult for the construction worker with the possible radius fracture, the one Madison had started the form for at 7 a.m., at 2 in the afternoon. The fracture was confirmed. The consult had been necessary. It was the kind of thing that would have been obvious to anyone who looked at the patient, and it had waited 6 hours because the chain of events that morning had disrupted the ordinary handoff. It had not caused the patient harm, but it had taken 6 hours. Madison thought about this in the way she thought about most things she could not change. She noted it, she put it in the file of things that had happened and could not be unhappened, and she moved forward. Vero found her at 7:20 near the elevator bank on the 3rd floor, where she had gone to check on Webb one last time before the night rotation started. He had something in his expression that she hadn't seen yet today. Not urgency, not the operational flatness she'd come to read as his default. Something that looked, if she was reading it right, like discomfort. "There's something Ose needs you to see," he said. "Now?" "Now." She followed him back to the consultation room. Ose was there with Torres, and there was a laptop open on the table showing a document. Not a scanned physical document like Galt's envelope, but a digital file, the kind generated by a system. Torres pulled the laptop toward her when she sat down. It was a personnel file. Her personnel file. Not Rivergate's version, the falsified one, but a combined document that she didn't recognize, with a header she had not seen before. "This was found on the laptop in room 214, Ose said, the one Galt had set up. He hadn't told us about it. He had copies of the contracts in the envelope, but the laptop had additional files he said he didn't know were there." Madison looked at the document on the screen. It was her Rivergate HR file, merged with a summary document, and the summary document had a header that read like an internal briefing. It had her service history, her unit designations, the broad outlines of her deployment record. It had her termination paperwork, the fabricated performance documentation, and the dates those documents had been generated. It also had something she had not expected. At the bottom of the document, in a section labeled Recommended Action, there were 3 lines of text. She read them. She read them again. Then she looked at Ose. "Who generated this document?" she said. Ose's expression was careful. "We're still confirming, but the metadata on the file shows it was created 6 weeks ago. The access credentials that created it are registered to a federal contractor license." She paused. "Not Hartwell. A different contractor. One with a current government services agreement." "What kind of services agreement?" Torres answered quietly. "Healthcare Facility Management Consulting. They have active contracts with 17 hospital systems in Ohio and 4 neighboring states." Madison looked back at the screen. At the 3 lines in the Recommended Action section, they read, "Subject to be removed from facility prior to federal audit initiation. Termination process to be completed no later than 30 days before OIG on-site review. Replacement placement recommended from approved contractor network." She was sitting in a consultation room in a hospital where she had just spent the entire day managing a cardiac emergency, cooperating with a federal investigation, and watching a corrupt administrator begin the process of losing everything he'd built. And she was looking at a document that said her removal from this building had not been Briggs's idea alone. Someone had recommended it. Someone with a federal contractor license and active agreements with 17 hospital systems had written the instruction that led to Harlan Briggs escorting her out of this building at 7:15 this morning. "How many hospitals?" she said. Ose looked at her. "We don't know yet. This is..." She stopped. "This is newer than what we came here for today." "How many hospitals is this contractor currently active in?" 17 confirmed in Ohio. The broader number. Torres glanced at his screen. "They have over 40 active agreements across the region." Madison looked at the document on the laptop screen, at the 3 lines that had given Harlan Briggs his instructions. at the contractor logo in the header that she didn't recognize but that Osei clearly did, because Osei's expression had the specific quality of a federal investigator who has just watched the edge of something much larger come into view. "What's the contractor's name?" Madison asked. Osei looked at Torres. Torres looked at Osei. "Meridian Health Systems Group," Osei said. "They're one of the largest healthcare management consulting firms in the Midwest." The room was quiet. "And they recommended my termination," Madison said. "Their document recommended it. Whether it was followed as an instruction or as—" Osei stopped. "We don't know the full relationship yet." Madison sat back in the chair. She was exhausted in a way that had moved past what coffee could fix, and she was looking at a screen that was telling her that the thing she had been fighting for 14 months inside one building was not confined to one building, that the gravity that had been pulling Rivergate toward mediocrity and misconduct had a source outside Rivergate, that Harlan Briggs, who had spent 14 months treating her like a problem to be managed, was possibly himself a managed piece of something larger. "I need to know," she said slowly, "whether Meridian has active contracts with any facility that has current military medical support agreements." Vero went very still beside her. She looked at him. He was looking at the screen with an expression that she had not seen on him before, not the flat control of a man operating in a situation he had prepared for. The specific expression of a man who has just heard something that has moved the situation outside the prepared category. "Vero," she said. He reached for his phone without looking away from the screen. "I need to make a call," he said. Vero stepped into the corridor to make his call, and the door closed behind him with the soft hydraulic finality of a hospital door that doesn't slam no matter how hard the day has been. Madison stayed at the table. She looked at the laptop screen, at the Meridian Health Systems Group header, at the 3 lines of recommended action, at her own name in a document she had never been meant to see. And she thought about the particular shape of what the last 14 months had actually been. She had believed, in the way that people who are good at something tend to believe, that competence was its own argument, that if she did the work correctly and consistently, the facts would eventually outweigh whatever friction surrounded them. This was not a naive belief exactly. She had lived enough life to know that systems were imperfect, and people were imperfect, and institutions were built from both, but it was an incomplete one. She had not fully accounted for the possibility that the friction wasn't incidental, that it was structural, that the building she'd been working inside for 14 months was itself a component of something that required her to be manageable. And when she turned out not to be manageable, the system had produced Harlan Briggs and his instructions and a box of fabricated documents. Osei was watching her from across the table with the patient, non-intrusive attention of someone who understood that she had just received information that required a moment. "How do you want to proceed?" Osei asked. Madison looked at her. "What are my options?" "You're a witness in an active investigation. You've already given your formal statement. What happens next with Meridian is our jurisdiction, not yours." Osei paused. "But I'm asking how you want to proceed with tonight. You've been awake since 11 last night. You have no formal role in this building right now. Legally, you're a terminated employee. The invalidation of that termination is in process, but isn't complete until the board acts. Which means I'm still technically not supposed to be here. Which means," Osei said carefully, "that I'm asking whether you need anything from us before you go get some sleep." Madison almost said she was fine. It was the automatic answer, the one that had served her adequately for years, in deployment, in the ER, in 14 months of Rivergate's particular brand of institutional erosion. She had said she was fine so many times and in so many contexts that it had become a reflex rather than an assessment. She stopped herself. "I need to know," she said instead, "that Webb is going to be properly monitored tonight, that whoever is on the cardiac floor understands his presentation history, his medication interaction, and that a second AFib episode is possible in the next 24 hours. I can make sure Gloria Tate has that brief before you leave," Osei said, "and I need to know that the board is being notified tonight, not tomorrow, tonight." "That's already in motion. Vero's JAG officer sent a formal notification to Rivergate's board chair 40 minutes ago." Osei closed her laptop. "The board chair's name is Dr. Pauline Wren. She's been on the phone with our office for the past half hour." Madison nodded. She stood up. Her legs ached in a way they hadn't earlier. The specific ache of a body that had been running on adrenaline and competence and had now received the signal that the acute phase was over. "I'll brief Gloria and then I'll go," she said. "Read." Osei said it without inflection, but with enough weight that Madison stopped. "What you did today. Clinically. That's documented." She paused. "For the record." Madison looked at her for a moment. Then she walked to the door. "Mom." Gloria Tate received the clinical brief the way she received most information, without performance, with full attention, asking 2 precise follow-up questions, and then nodding once to indicate she had what she needed. She had already updated the night rotation nursing staff on Webb's presentation history without being asked, because Gloria was the kind of charge nurse who did not require prompting to do the obvious correct thing, and Madison felt a specific, uncomplicated gratitude for this that she didn't have to express because Gloria would have found the expression unnecessary. She looked in through the window of room 4 on her way out. Webb was asleep. The monitor showed a rhythm that, while not perfect, was holding within an acceptable range for a man of his age and history and the day he had just had. His color in the low light of the room was close enough to normal that she could look at it without the part of her brain that never fully stopped doing clinical assessment throwing up a flag. She watched him for a moment through the glass. Then she turned and walked to the elevator. The parking lot at 9 p.m. was cold and mostly empty. The news vehicles that had been at the perimeter earlier in the day were gone. Deadlines had passed, or editors had decided the evening version of the story didn't warrant a truck sitting in the dark outside a hospital in Ashcroft. 2 of the military SUVs were still there. One of Osei's vehicles. A Rivergate security car she didn't recognize, which meant the overnight staff had shifted. She stood outside for a moment. The rain from that morning had stopped hours ago, and the asphalt was dry now, just dark, and the emergency lights above the ambulance bay were doing their slow red pulse into empty air. She had stood here at 7:15 this morning, with a folder in her hand and water in her hair, and the specific heavy knowledge that the building behind her had decided she was the problem. She had been awake for 22 hours. Her car was a gray 4-door with a dent in the rear quarter panel from a parking garage column 3 years ago that she had never gotten around to fixing. She sat in it for a moment without starting the engine and called her sister. Priya picked up on the second ring, which meant she had been waiting. "I saw something online," she said immediately. "About Rivergate. Are you okay?" "I'm okay." "Madison. Are you actually okay, or are you doing the thing where you say you're okay?" She put her head back against the seat. Outside the windshield, the ambulance bay lights pulsed. "I'm tired," she said. "I'm genuinely okay, and I'm also extremely tired, and I need to eat something that isn't half a granola bar." "What happened?" "It's a long story. I have time." "I don't, not tonight." She paused. "I'll call you tomorrow and tell you everything. I promise." Priya was quiet for a beat. "You sound different," she said. "Not bad different, just different." Madison thought about this. She thought about what it meant to spend 14 months in a place that was systematically trying to convince her that her instincts were wrong, her judgments were wrong, her way of doing the job was wrong, and then to spend one day watching all of that come apart. The exhaustion was real. The relief was complicated. The anger, the clean, specific anger at what had been done to her, and the more diffuse anger at what she'd seen done to a system of care that was supposed to serve sick people, that was also real, and she was not sure yet what she was going to do with it. "I'll call you tomorrow," she said again. "I love you." "I love you too," Priya said. "Eat something." She ended the call. She started the car. She drove out of the Rivergate parking lot at 9:12 p.m. and did not look in the rearview mirror. The call from Dr. Pauline Wren came at 8:17 the following morning. Madison had slept for 9 hours. Not well, not continuously, the way sleep comes when a body is running a backlog, full of half-assembled images and the tactile memory of clinical situations. And she was on her second cup of coffee when her phone rang. Wren was 60, a retired vascular surgeon who had moved into board governance 12 years ago, and she had a voice that was precise and unadorned in the way that people become after decades of delivering information that mattered. "Ms. Reed," she said, "I'm calling on behalf of the Rivergate Medical Center Board of Directors." "Good morning, Dr. Wren. I want to begin by telling you that the board met by emergency call last night from 9 p.m. until approximately 1 a.m. We reviewed the OIG documentation, the JAG officer's report on your termination, and a preliminary findings summary from Special Agent Osai's office." A pause. "Your termination is formally invalidated as of this morning. All fabricated documentation has been removed from your personnel file. You will receive written confirmation of this within the hour." Madison sat at her kitchen table and looked at her coffee cup. She had known this was coming. Osei had said the board notification was in motion, but hearing it said formally by the board chair of the institution that had fired her landed differently than anticipating it. "Thank you," she said. "I also want to tell you, personally and on the record, that what was done to you inside this institution was wrong. The board's failure to have governance structures that would have caught this earlier is something we are going to have to answer for." Wren's voice was even, not performative. "I don't say this to manage your response. I say it because it's true, and you're owed a direct statement of it." "I appreciate that. There are several things the board needs to discuss with you when you're ready. Your return, if you choose to return. A potential advisory role in the governance review process. And," a brief pause, "there is a formal process underway regarding Director Briggs's position, which I cannot detail yet, but which will be resolved in a manner consistent with what the OIG investigation has established." "When you say resolved, he will not be returning to this hospital in any capacity," Wren said it flatly. "That is the board's position as of last night, and it is not going to change." Madison looked out her kitchen window. It was overcast but not raining. The street outside was doing the ordinary things streets did in the morning. A dog walker, a car warming up, a neighbor she vaguely recognized bringing in a recycling bin. "Dr. Wren," she said, "before we talk about my return or any advisory role, I need to know what the board's position is on Meridian Health Systems Group." A pause, longer than the previous ones. "That's a conversation that will require more than a phone call," Wren said. "I know. But I need to know, in general terms, that the board understands the scope of what Osei's team found on that laptop, that Briggs didn't generate those instructions independently." "The board is aware." Wren's voice was careful. "And the board is cooperating fully with the OIG's expanded review. The Meridian relationship, our consulting contract with them, has been suspended pending investigation." "How long was the contract active?" 4 years?" 4 years. 2 years before Madison had arrived. Long enough to have shaped the institution she'd walked into. Long enough that some of what she'd experienced from her first week, the particular culture of Rivergate, the way inconvenient competence was treated as a management problem, may have been downstream of something that was never about clinical quality at all. "Okay," she said. "Will you come in?" Wren asked. "Not today if you're not ready, but when you are." "I'll come in," Madison said. "I need a day." "Of course, take whatever you need." A pause. "And Ms. Reed, I've been reviewing the clinical record from yesterday. Dr. Noor's notes, Gloria Tate's nursing documentation, Lieutenant Colonel Vero's formal report." Another pause. "You should know that the record it's clear. What you did yesterday is clear in the record." Madison didn't answer immediately. She thought about the way the word clear felt, in the context of 14 months of being told she was unclear, imprecise, out of scope, resistant, a problem. "Thank you, Dr. Wren," she said. She ended the call. She sat at her kitchen table for a moment with both hands around the coffee cup. Then she picked up her phone and called Priya because she had promised she would, and because some things needed to be said out loud to someone who knew you before you needed to be anyone in particular. The formal public accounting began on a Thursday, 11 days after the events at Rivergate. The OIG held a press briefing from their Cincinnati field office. Not a dramatic announcement, not the kind of event that filled rooms with cameras, but a structured statement delivered by the regional director that laid out the findings in the specific, undramatic language of federal investigators who were being careful and were going to be careful publicly. Procurement fraud, falsified documentation, obstruction, a former hospital director and a former operations manager named as subjects, a healthcare consulting firm under expanded review, cooperation from a former contractor witness. The numbers were in the statement: 3.8 million over 31 months. 43 active consulting contracts in 6 states under OIG review. The name Madison Reed did not appear in the OIG statement, which was how she preferred it. She was a witness and a victim of the personnel misconduct, and the record would reflect both of those things in the appropriate context. But she was not the story the federal investigators were telling, because the story they were telling was larger than one nurse in one hospital, and making it about one person would have been both incomplete and, she thought, a way of avoiding the actual problem, which was the system, the gravity of the thing, the way institutions could be bent toward protecting arrangements that had nothing to do with their stated purpose, and everything to do with who was making money on what. Harlan Briggs did not appear at the press briefing. He was at that point represented entirely by Lowell Park, who had negotiated a cooperation agreement with the OIG that would reduce Briggs's exposure in exchange for complete documentation of the Meridian relationship. This was the transaction of a man who had understood belatedly that the choice was between some accountability and all of it, and had chosen the available option. Park had earned whatever Briggs was paying him. Dale Fitch did not have a Lowell Park. Fitch had been extradited from Columbus on federal wire fraud charges and was facing a separate obstruction count for the security footage deletion, which had been executed from a hotel room in a way that the forensic trail documented with a specificity that left no room for the argument Briggs had tried to make on his behalf. Fitch had also made the specific error of making 3 calls to Meridian's regional director in the 48 hours before his arrest, which the OIG had on record, which connected the obstruction directly to the larger network. The Meridian regional director had retained his own attorney. The firm had issued a statement expressing full cooperation with federal authorities and announcing an internal governance review, which was the statement such firms always issued, and which meant the same thing it always meant, that the people inside the firm were assessing the shape of what could be demonstrated and adjusting their position accordingly. Madison read about all of this from her apartment, from Priya's couch in Columbus for 2 days, and from a diner near Rivergate where she had gone for breakfast on the 9th day, because she'd needed to be in the vicinity of the building without being in it. She had been back inside Rivergate twice in those 11 days, both times by appointment. Once to give a supplementary statement to Torres and an OIG attorney. Once to meet with Dr. Pauline Wren and 2 other board members in the same conference suite where Senator Webb had collapsed, which was now stripped of the event furniture and laid out as a standard meeting room, which was itself a kind of marker. The meeting with the board had been 2 hours. Wren had been direct, as she had been on the phone. The 2 other board members, a hospital administrator from Columbus named Garrett and a healthcare attorney named Solis, had been carefully professional in the way of people who were managing a legal situation and a moral one simultaneously, and were not always sure which should lead. The conversation about Madison's return was real. The conversation about what her role might be was real. And the conversation about the governance review, about what Rivergate needed to look like going forward, who needed to be involved in reconstructing the institutional culture that had made 14 months of this possible, was the conversation she had been most attentive to because it was the one that went past her and into the question of what this building was going to be for the people who worked in it and the patients who came through its doors. She had not given a final answer on any of it. She had said she was considering. She had said she needed to understand what the board's actual authority was going to look like going forward, what the governance structure was going to be, whether the reforms were going to be real or the kind that looked real from outside. Wren had said she expected nothing less from someone who had been watching institutional performance for 14 months. It was the closest Wren had come to dry humor, and Madison had appreciated it. Senator Webb was discharged from Rivergate on the 8th day. His rhythm had held through the hospitalization, the electrolyte management had been consistent, and Noor had adjusted his medication regimen with the careful attention of a physician who had spent 8 days being reminded that the original prescription had nearly killed him. He walked out of the building on a Tuesday morning with 2 aides and the careful gait of a man who had been frightened and was not going to pretend he hadn't. He stopped at the nursing station on the 3rd floor on his way out. Gloria Tate was there. He thanked her by name, specifically, for the monitoring and the night checks and the efficiency of the handoffs between shifts. Gloria received this with the professional nod of a woman who did not require a senator's validation to know she had done her job well, but who also was not going to be rude about gratitude. Then he asked if Madison was in the building. She wasn't. But he sent her a message that afternoon through the formal channel his office used for written communication, and she read it that evening on Priya's couch. And it said, in part, "I've been in public life for 30 years. I've met a lot of people who were described to me as exceptional before I'd formed my own opinion. I've learned to discount those descriptions. What I saw in that room on Tuesday was not someone being described. It was someone working. There's a difference and it's not subtle. I intend to say this in the appropriate context. You have my word on that." She read it twice. Then she put the phone face down on Priya's coffee table and looked at the ceiling for a moment. Priya, who had been pretending to read from the other end of the couch, said without looking up, "Good message or complicated message?" "Both," Madison said. "That's usually the good kind." She went back to Rivergate on the 12th day. Not for a meeting, not for a statement. She went because Wren had called the evening before and said that Dr. Noor had requested her, specifically, for a consult on a patient in the cardiac observation unit. A 68-year-old woman with a presentation that Noor wanted a second set of eyes on, and the eyes she wanted were Madison's. She had no badge. She had a visitor pass issued at the front desk by a receptionist named Jean, who had been at Rivergate for 8 years, and who handed her the pass with the quiet efficiency of someone who had been informed to expect her and was not going to make a production of it. The lobby was the lobby she had walked out of on that Tuesday, 11 days ago. The same emergency lights above the ambulance bay doing their slow red cycle. The same arrangement of waiting room chairs, 2 of which were occupied by a man with his arm in a makeshift sling and an older woman reading something on a tablet. The same hallway to the ER where she had worked for 14 months. Different, though, in the specific way that places are different when you have been away from them during a period in which something significant happened inside them. Not visually different, atmospherically different. The particular charge that sits in a building after events have moved through it and settled. She took the elevator to the 3rd floor. The patient was Dolores Anand, 68, retired schoolteacher, and she had the particular quality of a woman who had spent 40 years managing rooms full of other people's children and had developed a tolerance for chaos that read, in a clinical setting, as unusual calm. She was also clearly uncomfortable and doing a specific kind of work to not show it that Madison recognized immediately, because she had been doing that work herself for most of the last 2 weeks. Noor's concern was a rhythm abnormality that had appeared overnight, not a fib, something more subtle. A pattern on the strip that Noor had been watching for 6 hours and that didn't fit cleanly into the obvious categories. She showed Madison the strip. She showed her the medication list. She showed her the overnight nursing notes. Madison looked at all of it. She looked at Mrs. Anand. She sat with the strip for a moment. "Can I examine her?" she asked Noor. "That's why I called you." She did the examination the way she did all examinations, systematically, without commentary, building the picture one component at a time. Mrs. Anand submitted to this with the philosophical patience of a woman who had decided to cooperate with what was happening to her body without catastrophizing about it. "How long have you had the pressure sensation?" Madison asked. "Not the chest tightness, the pressure specifically below your left shoulder blade." Mrs. Anand looked at her. "How did you know about that?" "Your posture when you breathe. You're compensating slightly to the right." "How long?" "Since this morning. I didn't mention it because I thought it was just muscle. From lying in the bed." Madison looked at the strip again. She looked at the medication list. She looked at Mrs. Anand's face and her posture and the specific thing her breathing was doing that she had been filing since she walked into the room. She turned to Noor. "I want to look at her potassium trend over the last 48 hours, and I want to repeat 12 lead. And I want to know if she's been on any NSAIDs in the last 2 weeks, prescription or over-the-counter." Noor was already moving to the computer. "Naproxen," she said, reading from the admission medication history.
Self-reported as needed, knee pain. Madison looked at Mrs. Anand. How often is as needed? Mrs. Anand had the expression of a woman caught in a small truth. More like twice a day, she said. My knee has been bad for months. The NSAID interaction with her cardiac medication was not the only factor, but it was a factor, and the pattern on the strip, combined with the potassium trend and the posture compensation and the pressure under the left shoulder blade, assembled into something that wasn't dramatic but was specific. And specific was what you needed in order to do anything useful about it. She and Noor spent 40 minutes with Mrs. Anand.
The intervention was straightforward once the picture was clear. The strip responded the way strips respond when you've addressed the correct thing rather than the approximate one. When they came out into the corridor afterward, Noor stood for a moment looking at the closed door of Mrs. Anand's room. I would have gotten there, she said. I know, Madison said. You have good instincts. It would have taken me another few hours. Hours matter. Noor looked at her directly. I'm going to say something I should have said on the first day you walked into that conference suite. She paused. I've been in this hospital for 6 years. I've worked with a lot of nurses. I knew inside of 10 minutes that you were better than the role you were being kept in. She stopped. I didn't say anything. I told myself it wasn't my concern. That's the thing I have to live with. Madison looked at her. She thought about Marcus in the break room. About Donna Pratt and her cold coffee and her quiet afternoon. About Roland Pettit and his careful posture and the things he'd accepted as clerical patterns. About a whole building full of people who had seen something and made the calculation in that specific institutional gravity that it wasn't their concern. Did you file any notes about my clinical judgment in the period I was on corrective monitoring? She asked. Noor's jaw shifted. No? If you had, it would have been useful. I know that now. Then that's what you do differently going forward. She said it without heat, without the satisfaction of having delivered a lesson, just factually. There's always a next time. Noor held her gaze for a moment. Then she nodded, once, with the specific precision of someone integrating something that was going to change how they operated. Will you come back? She asked. To this floor, to this hospital. I'm considering it, Madison said. I hope you do, Noor said. Then she went back into Mrs. Anand's room, because there was still work to do. She was in the elevator going down when her phone buzzed. Vero. She answered it. Meridian, he said. I thought you'd want to know. The expanded OIG review has confirmed active contracts in 6 states. Of those, 4 overlap with VA-affiliated facilities. Not direct military medical contracts, but facilities that hold active veteran care agreements. His voice was the operational flatness she'd learned to read as serious. Medcom has initiated a separate review of those 4. The overlap is being treated as a national security adjacent concern, given the potential for procurement fraud inside veteran healthcare infrastructure. She thought about what she'd asked him in the consultation room 11 days ago, whether Meridian had active contracts with any facility holding military medical support agreements. The question she'd asked, because she'd spent enough time in those facilities to understand what it meant for the procurement systems inside them to be bent. How long will the review take? She asked. Months. These things move at the speed they move. He paused. But it's moving. That's what I wanted you to know. Thank you. One more thing. A pause, shorter than the others. There's a formal commendation being prepared by Medcom for your conduct during the Webb situation and your cooperation with the OIG investigation. It'll be added to your service summary. Another pause. I wanted to tell you before it arrived officially. She stood in the elevator as the doors opened on the ground floor. The lobby was doing its ordinary afternoon things. Visitors, staff, the ambient sound of a building that was always in some form of motion. Vero, she said. Read. Thank you for coming here. A beat. You did the work, he said. We just drove. She almost said something. She didn't. She ended the call and stepped out into the lobby. The meeting with Ren that she had been building toward happened on the 15th day. She went in with the specific clarity of someone who had spent 2 weeks thinking through what she was actually willing to do and what she wasn't, and what the conditions were that would make her answers to those questions different. Wren had brought Solis, the board attorney, and a woman Madison hadn't met, introduced as Dr. Karimov, a healthcare systems consultant who had been engaged by the board to design the governance reform process. Karimov was direct and competent and had the specific quality of someone who had seen institutional failure up close enough to have stopped being surprised by it and started being surgical about it instead, which Madison respected. The conversation was 2 hours again. It covered Madison's reinstatement, which was formalized during the meeting, paperwork signed, badge authorization initiated. It covered a newly created position, Associate Director of Clinical Standards, which had been Wren's framing for a role that would exist inside the nursing structure, but with board-level reporting access and a specific mandate to function as an internal quality and safety escalation point, independent of administrative approval chains. It was not a perfect position. The title was unwieldy, and the reporting structure had complications, and there were 3 things in the draft job description that Madison pushed back on directly, 2 of which Wren accepted, and 1 of which required a 30-minute conversation with Solis about what the board's legal exposure would be in different governance configurations. She was not performing reluctance. She was genuinely assessing whether what was being offered was real, whether the structural changes being proposed would hold once the immediate pressure of federal scrutiny began to fade, as it would, as it always did, eventually, and the institution settled back into its own gravity. The Meridian contract was active for 4 years, she said at one point to all 3 of them. That means this building's culture was shaped by a consulting relationship designed to prioritize procurement optimization over clinical quality for 4 years. The reforms you're describing need to account for that. You can't just remove the director and change the reporting structure and call it fixed. Wren looked at her steadily. No, she agreed. We can't, which is why the board is funding an independent clinical culture audit, conducted by Dr. Karimov's firm, that will take 8 months and will produce binding recommendations. Binding on the board? Binding on the board. In writing. Madison looked at Karimov. What does your track record look like on these audits? Karimov gave her a flat, slightly amused look. You're welcome to review the published outcomes from our last 6 engagements. I'll give you the names of the board contacts at each institution. I'll take those names, Madison said. Wren made a sound that was the most unguarded thing Madison had heard from her, something between an exhale and approval. I'll note for the record, Wren said, that this is exactly the quality of engagement the board needs in this role. I'm not doing it for the board, Madison said. Not unkindly. I'm doing it for the patients. I want that distinction documented. Noted and documented, Wren said, and frankly, appropriate. She signed the paperwork. She took the badge authorization slip. The actual badge would be ready the following morning. And she shook hands with Wren and Karimov and Solis, and then she was in the hallway outside the administrative suite that had, 15 days ago, been the room where she was told she had 45 seconds to clear the building. The hallway looked like a hallway. The carpet was the same. The lighting was the same institutional fluorescent that she had spent 14 months working under. There was a supply cart parked near the elevator that had been there before and was there now. She stood for a moment. She thought about something her first field commander had said to her years ago, in a context that had nothing to do with a hospital in Ohio. He had said it after a situation in which she had made a call alone with incomplete information, and the call had been correct, and afterward she had been questioning whether she had been right or lucky. He had said, "The decision and the outcome are 2 different things. You made the right decision. The outcome confirms it, but didn't create it. Know the difference." She had been making the right decisions in this building for 14 months. The outcome, the federal investigation, the invalidated termination, the badge authorization slip in her hand, confirmed that. But the decisions had been right before anyone confirmed them, before Varro drove through the gate, before Galt unlocked a storage room, before Ose put a laptop on a table. The decisions had been right when the only people who knew it were Madison herself and the patients she had been looking after. That was the thing about competence that didn't fit on a commendation. It didn't wait for validation to be real. It was real in the moment it was exercised, regardless of whether the institution around it was capable of recognizing it. She walked to the elevator. She pressed the button. The doors opened. Inside were two nurses she recognized from the ER rotation, younger than her, day shift, one of whom she'd worked alongside during a particularly difficult overnight 6 months ago, when they'd had 3 serious traumas and not enough staff. The nurse's name was Brianna. She had been good that night. Efficient, calm, not prone to the specific kind of panic that manifested as excessive talking. Brianna looked at her when the doors opened. She looked at the badge authorization slip in Madison's hand. Something moved across her face. Recognition, then something more complicated. "You're coming back?" she asked. "I am," Madison said, and stepped into the elevator. Brianna was quiet for a moment, then, "Good. This place has been weird without you." The doors closed. Madison looked at the number panel. The lobby button was lit. She stood in the small, ordinary space of an elevator in a hospital that had spent 14 months trying to be rid of her and had failed, and she felt the specific, imperfect human weight of what it meant to be still standing in a place that had done its best to make you leave. It was not triumph, exactly. Triumph implied the finish line, and there was no finish line. There was only the next shift, the next patient, the next decision made with incomplete information in imperfect conditions, and the knowledge that you were capable of making it correctly. There was the work that was waiting, the governance reform process, the clinical standards role, the 8-month audit, the slow and unglamorous business of trying to change the culture of a building from inside it. There was Dolores Anand on the 3rd floor who had pressure below her left shoulder blade that she'd been compensating for all morning. There was whatever patient was coming through the ER doors tonight who would need someone to notice the thing everyone else almost missed. There was all of it, waiting, as it always had been. The elevator reached the lobby. The doors opened. She walked out into the light. 3 weeks later, at a small ceremony in a hospital conference room that had been arranged by Wren and attended by the board, Dr. Noor, Gloria Tate, Varro, and 2 of his soldiers, and Special Agent Osei, Madison Reed received her new credentials and her formal appointment as Associate Director of Clinical Standards at Rivergate Medical Center. Senator Webb attended by video call. He looked significantly better than the last time she had seen him in person. He said 4 sentences: that he had been briefed on the reforms underway at Rivergate, that he had communicated to the appropriate oversight committees his expectation of full federal follow-through on the Meridian Review, that he had been told Madison Reed would be overseeing clinical standards going forward, and that this made him, as a former patient of this institution, feel something he was willing to call relieved. He was not a sentimental man, and the 4 sentences were not sentimental. They were the sentences of a politician who had been frightened and was now paying attention, and that was worth something real. Varro shook her hand after the ceremony. He had flown in from Columbus for the afternoon, which she had not expected and which she did not comment on, because his coming said the thing that commenting on it would have diminished. "The Medcom commendation went into your file this morning," he said. "Official." "I know, I got the notification." He held her hand for a moment longer than a standard handshake. Not much longer, just enough to be its own statement. "You never stopped being one of us," he said. "I want that on the record." She looked at him. She thought about what that meant. The us of people who had gone to places and done things that required a specific kind of decision-making under conditions that removed all the comfortable margins, who had learned that the decision was real before the outcome confirmed it, who carried that knowledge in the way you carry something that has changed the structure of how you see things. "It's on the record," she said. Gloria Tate, who was standing nearby and had overheard, made a face that was not quite a smile but was in that direction. The face of a woman who had spent a career being competent in a building that didn't always notice, watching another woman be recognized for the same. Osei was near the door, already on her phone, already on to the next phase of whatever the expanded Meridian investigation required her attention for. She caught Madison's eye across the room and gave the nod of one professional to another, clean, unadorned, sufficient. Madison nodded back. She stood in the conference room with her new credentials in her hand and the ordinary sounds of a hospital moving around her. A pager, a cart in the corridor, someone's sneakers on the tile floor. And she thought about the woman who had stood in the rain 11 days ago with a folder and a badge that no longer worked, and the particular kind of tired that comes not from overwork, but from fighting the same battle every day inside a system designed to make you stop. She was still tired. She was always going to be somewhat tired. That was the job, and she had chosen the job, and she was not going to perform the opposite of what was true. But she was here. The badge in her hand was real. The room she was standing in was different from the room it had been, in the specific ways that mattered, and the ways it was still the same were the ways she was going to spend the next months and years working on. She had been underestimated. She had been dismissed, documented against, publicly fired, and left in the rain. And she had walked back through the doors anyway, because a man's life was at stake, and because that was the job, and because something in her, the part that had made calls alone in the dark in places that never made the news, had never learned to stop. That part wasn't special. It wasn't exceptional in the way commendations suggested. It was just the part that kept working when everything around it said to stop, and it was available to anyone willing to let it be. The room was still talking. Ren was saying something to Solis. Brianna from the ER had come up with 2 colleagues, all 3 of them looking simultaneously professional and slightly unsure of the right register for this kind of occasion, which was itself a very human quality and one that Madison found, in this moment, genuinely good. She went to talk to them. She had things to learn about what the last 2 weeks had looked like from inside the ER. She had a job to do. She started doing it,